bog hags, and you thought water bag was bad.
No, but like that's what they're called.
That's actually what they're called.
Oh, it's still pretty mean, though. I mean, no wonder they were pissed off the whole time.
Yeah, they were like, well.
Bog hags, that's what you're calling us. Yeah, well, I will drink your blood and steal your children, you jerks.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Flux.
And I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Prat Chat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month, we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books with a special guest.
This month, we're talking about The Colour of Magic. The answer is octarine. They tell you within 3 pages.
And our guest is writer, editor, and podcaster Joel Martin. Welcome, Joel.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Liz. Good to be here.
We're so glad to have you. Look, I feel like, in a strange way, that I manufactured a guest for the podcast because, look, we can cut to the chase a little bit. It's my fault that you've read Terry Pratchett, isn't it?
A little bit, yes. You came on to my podcast.
The Morning Bell.
Yeah, you snuck your way onto the Morning Bell somehow.
I don't know how.
It was interesting. And it was that day that you went to the science... They don't even have a... fantasy section at the Brunswick Street Bookstore. They have a science fiction / nothingness section.
I think a void is what you want in the science fiction / void section.
/ void section, yeah. So there was one Terry Pratchett book, I think. I think there was Dodger, and then there was this, The Colour of Magic.
Yeah.
And then you pointed it out to me, and I said, oh, should I start with The Colour of Magic? And you were like, Liz might be upset, but yes.
Yeah, well,
start.
See, but that was a personal recommendation for you because I knew that you are an old school fantasy fan.
And big sword and sorcery.
Very much your kind of bag. Whereas, and look, you know, also, as listeners of the podcast will know, I started with The Colour of Magic. The shorthand story version of the story is I ran out of Douglas Adams books and my mum went into a bookstore and asked them, what should I get for my son? He loves Douglas Adams and there's no more. And they said, try this. And so she bought the first one, which was the first Discworld one anyway. And I read that first. And I look, it has a very special place in my heart as much as we will, I'm sure, discuss. It has many differences from the rest of the Pratchett canon.
You know, if a book literally was in your heart, it would probably be one of the valves because it's the most similar shape.
We need to do a spin-off anatomy podcast.
A little bit.
I feel.
Oh, there's some good anatomy in this book as well. They had some really good stuff about eye anatomy, so we'll get into that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, this is going to be all right. Look, I'm really looking forward. I feel like we should just get into it because a lot of people have been waiting for us to do this book.
Can't think why.
Well, because it's the first one, Liz.
Yeah, also I did actually really enjoy it on the reread, so...
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and so did I. And Joel, this is your second time you read it for the podcast.
Yes, that's right. So I read it when I bought the book, and then I read it again, I think, a week ago. And I also listened to the abridged audiobook with Tony Robinson, who did the recording. Now, I never knew it was abridged.
What did they cut out?
Lots of stuff, like half the book. It's only like 3 hours long.
All the Tony Robinson ones were abridged because originally they were released on 2 cassettes, so you couldn't fit a whole book on 2 cassettes.
It's not because he was too busy doing Time Team.
I was just about to say, because I love Time Team.
Well, I think the first ones probably predate Time Team, but then I'm not sure how long Time Team's been going.
Yeah, see, I watched Time Team before Blackadder, so I was always like, oh, the guy from Time Team's on Blackadder.
Yep, that's right.
Yes, that was the same.
This, and I am equally appalled. No, that's fine. It's good. Did you go on and read any other Terry Pratchett's, Joel?
No, so what I wanted to do was to come on this one completely without zero knowledge of the entire franchise. So I would seem as ignorant as possible about the canon.
Oh, you're a control group.
Yeah.
It's good.
That's right.
It's proper science. Or what is it? The not quite right magic?
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to take away from this and maybe get Liz to recommend me the second book that I should read.
I mean,
and
if
that could be sequentially or...
Yeah, okay. I'll give it a think across the episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think that's appropriate. I mean, I was responsible for your first one, so it seems only right that Liz picks your second one.
Absolutely.
If you're not going to pick it yourself.
No.
Of course. Now, the other thing that I should say, the reason that we're talking about it this month is as we record this, it is just a few days past the 35th anniversary of the publication of The Colour of Magic. So the Discworld is 35 years old this year, which is, an exciting time. It's nice to be reading a venerable fantasy series that is nonetheless slightly younger than me. We don't often think about how long ago the books were written. And a lot of the ones we've been reading, they were written a good 10 to 15 years after this.
I feel like it's a weird passage of time thing because I always think of these books as simultaneously really recent and having always been around.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of them having been written in the 80s and 90s, but I'm also like, I remember going to the shop and the new Discworld book came out. So it's a strange passage of time. And just last night I was thinking about how this works because I think of the 70s as very recently, but now I realize that we are as far from the 70s as the 70s were from the 20s, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. It's the exact same feeling. Like I went into bookshops and I saw Terry Pratchett, and my family were not big readers, so they never sent me to the Terry Pratchett cool section of these are the books that were coming out. They went to the canon of English literature, so I read all of that and ended up incredibly pretentious as a result of that. So I read Pratchett quite late because of Ben. But yeah, it's weird to think that in one way Pratchett now is in that canon of fantasy, right? 35 plus years is a long time.
And I think he talked about, he didn't talk about it a lot, but he did talk about it sometimes that, he felt that there was a clear, he didn't get picked out as he never won any major literary awards or anything like that. Because he was writing both comedy and fantasy, he was doing the two things that people despise
would never get
the most.
an award. Yes.
Doesn't matter if you are smart if you don't use the big smart words. Well, he does use the big smart words.
He does.
It's just,
He also invents a few.
He was just in a category that is just looked down upon, which is very demoralizing.
Yeah, and he's doing all this big smart stuff next to some really silly fun stuff as well.
Yeah.
Which anyway, I think that's all going to come out. Although the last thing I'll say about the book and the age of the book is that I know that I first read it in would have been about 1993, because it was before I briefly lived in Perth. Because I went to a boarding school in Perth very briefly, and I remember getting in the English literature class saying, I know what'll impress these guys. And I'm like, so there's this great author, I don't know if you know about him, he's called Terry Pratchett, and everyone there went, because he'd been at a literary festival in Perth the year before and they'd all been forced to go and listen to him, and they hated it because of that. And I was like, what?
How
and
unlucky.
I'd never met him because that was the first time I ever lived in a city, so I'd never been anywhere where he'd signed books before. So I was like, so I know I at least read the first one no later than 93, but this copy, which I always thought of was my original copy, is a 96 edition. So it can't be my first copy of the book that I first read. Right. So I must have replaced it at some point fairly early on. Would have been while I was working at a bookshop in my first job. So I don't know. I don't understand. But what are you going to do?
So what about the editions of the book? So the cover art, just very curiously, so again, knowing nothing about these books...
Yeah.
I don't know what the cover art is telling me. Is that just me?
Well, the artist, we've talked a lot about him on the podcast. It's Josh Kirby, was a very prolific fantasy artist. Did a lot of book covers, and did all of the Pratchett covers, not just the Discworld books, but his other books too, or nearly all of them, right up until his death. And this was the first Discworld one that he did. So it's very interesting. We'll come back to this, but even on my edition of the book, I think that it might be different on yours. I'm not sure, because you can't even see Two Flower on the cover of the book. But on mine, there is a depiction of Two Flower, and he is actually drawn literally with four eyes.
Wow.
Because he's a nerd.
Yeah. And I was reading about this, and because in the book, as we'll get to, he's described as having four eyes, which is clearly meant to be an allusion to the fact that he's wearing glasses. And no one on the Discworld knows what those are, or at least no one in Ankh-Morpork at this stage of the narrative. But there's two camps online where the Kidby fans are like, this is his incredible imaginative interpretation of the text. Yeah. And other people are like, this is evidence that he really doesn't read it very closely at all. So yeah, I don't know. You could go either way, I suppose. But it is a weird choice. Yeah. And also he's very small on the cover, so you have to kind of squint to see, which seems appropriate considering that we're talking about whether or not he's got four eyes.
And lumpy. Everything's lumpy.
Oh yeah, that's a real hallmark of Kirby art.
Kirby, yeah.
The luggage has got some really muscular legs.
You know what? We'll come back to the luggage because and in fact, a lot of the things on this cover because I have many questions.
Really muscular ankles, actually.
Yeah.
Well, they've got to support a lot of weight. But yeah. Anyway, look, we should get into discussion of the book itself. And as is traditional, we'll start with a reading of the blurb. On a world supported on the back of a giant turtle, sex unknown, a gleeful, explosive, wickedly eccentric expedition sets out. There's an avaricious but inept wizard, a naive tourist whose luggage moves on hundreds of dear little legs, dragons who only exist if you believe in them, and, of course, the edge of the planet. And the edge, I should say, is in all caps. It's not in title case, so it is not referring to the guitarist from U2. Which would be weird, wouldn't it? Yeah. So one of the unique things about the book is, unlike most of Pratchett's other work, and unlike certainly most of the Discworld, this book is broken up into parts. They're not really chapters. They're just sort of separate books, I guess. Kind of like pyramids, which we covered in episode 5. And 2 of them have a prologue. And the first one has the same name as the whole book, The Colour of Magic. And in the prologue, this is the first time the Discworld is ever introduced to a reader.
But it is so super familiar that that just washed over me.
Yeah.
You're not a fan of these cosmic turtle entries, are you?
I get it. I get it.
It's a giant
There's
turtle.
a big turtle and
Yeah.
there's elephants and it's on a disc. Like, I really like the stuff towards the end of the book that described the colors and the water going over the edge really quick. But I get it. But I also understand this is the first one. So, like, if you're ever going to go all in on the description of all the stuff, this is the time and the place.
I think, it seems that Terry would have had a bit of a Stan Lee kind of Marvel opinion, which is that he doesn't know which book is going to be somebody's first one. So he's got to have that introduction.
Right, okay.
But
so
having,
everyone, yeah.
But having said that, like, it's really not very relevant to the plot of nearly any of the other books. Like, this is one of the very few books where the fact that they're on a flat disc, on the back of 4 elephants, on a turtle is actually important.
Plus, he gets to make that Big Bang joke.
Yeah, which is such a good joke.
Yeah.
Oof, thumbs up.
It's just the payoff of the setup was just good.
I remember reading, because there's 2 puns there, because there's the Big Bang one. So this is where we're talking about people's theories about what will happen with the turtle. One of which is that, he'll find another turtle and mate and they'll make new world turtles.
What will the elephants do while they're doing that?
Yeah, that's a really awkward
Getting tanned.
time for them.
Yeah.
And how do they get born? Like, do they just come with the turtle? I guess they must, because the world comes with the turtle.
Yeah.
So they're part of the turtle. Then.
What came first, the turtle or the elephants?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe the elephants get it on with the elephants that are on the back of the other turtle at the same time.
I figured the elephants are kind of like ABBA, like they're just all like with each other.
Yeah, but they deny it in interviews.
Yeah, they're just
Yeah.
like, no, we're not here.
But when they break up, then like everything is bad.
Yeah, that's the end of the Discworld. It's not actually anything to do with the turtle. It's the elephants are like, I can't work with you guys. One of them meets a 5th elephant. And then, like, it's a whole Yoko Ono situation.
Oh, yeah.
Who knows?
But the hit song Rim Rim.
But yeah, so that's the Big Bang Theory. But the other one, where he just keeps swimming forever into nothingness, is called the Steady Gate Theory, which is a pun on the Steady State theory of the universe, which I quite liked as well. So that was good. Although, interestingly, like, they keep talking about how nobody knows the sex of a Tuan. He's repeatedly referred to as a he.
That's because of the maleness default.
Yeah.
If he's doing something important, he must be a guy.
Yeah.
Later
He's literally
on,
holding up the world.
yeah. Later on, he's a bit more careful about it. Terry is. I mean, he's like says he or she, or not in this book, but in later books. So which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and as a first-time reader, that was like surprising because he came into it and I was like, okay, the sex of the turtle. Wait, it's a dude. He says it's a guy. It's he. And then I didn't understand the point of bringing it up right at the start. Then I thought, oh, okay, maybe this is the Chekhov's gun moment. Am I getting it really early in the book? And that was okay, maybe this is actually relevant rather than just a setup for a really killer joke, which is fine too.
Yeah.
I remember reading a thing where people were talking about the challenges of translating Pratchett into other languages, because he's super popular. He's been translated into a lot of languages, and consistently one of the hardest things to translate is puns.
Yeah.
and translating the Big Bang Theory as a pun, where who knows? I don't even know how you translate Big Bang as a theory into other languages, whether it is referred to as, large noise theory or what. But finding a term that both puns on that and amazing.
That would do a translator's head in.
The echo in the spiritual something
Oh,
theory.
A reflected sound of underground spirits. The weird thing is all the jokes, not a single joke in this book was a surprise to me. I was really, a lot of the other books we've been rereading, I was like, I'd forgotten this bit. I'd forgotten approximately probably 70 to 80% of what goes on in pyramids, for example. Like I had no idea. But this one just felt very familiar. I think I must have read it several times when I first got it.
No, you know what my theory on that is? That it was your first one, and it's kind of like a spell that it lodges in your brain, taking up the space that other books/spells might otherwise have lodged in. So
I like
that. Yeah, that's a good theory.
Yeah, I'm into it. I think it also, it's probably not insignificant that I was reading this. I was not a big fantasy reader at the time.
Because you were quite young.
I was quite young, but I'd been reading a lot more sci-fi and particularly like weird science fantasy stuff, like the big one being Douglas Adams. And I was always looking for other stuff like him, and there isn't a lot, like I think.
No.
But there's some very... and I've said this about some of the other early books, there's some very Adamsy jokes. I mean, the whole having a joke about the Big Bang, that's, I mean, in the original Hitchhikers, say For People Rocks is described as the best bang since the big one, and you're like, that's great. And this felt very familiar, but also very different, because like the only fantasy I'd really read was The Hobbit. And I was one of those people who got a third the way through the first book of The Lord of the Rings and was like, are they going to do anything?
Yeah, is something good to happen?
The first one's so good.
I know.
They have the Tom Bombadil song. When Tom Bombadil and Glorfindel find them and...
Yeah. See, I don't understand the cultish following that Tom Bombadil has, but that's for a different episode.
You mean in the book or in real life?
In real life.
There's a cultish following for Tom
everyone
Bombadil?
loves Tom. I think it's because of his exclusion from the movies.
Yeah.
That everyone doubled down really hard on how good he is.
I'm mad that they didn't have the Bath song, because I think the Bath song is actually the best part of Lord of the Rings.
That's a good
controversial opinion, but that is the best part of it.
Yeah.
I've got a controversial opinion for you. I think the films are better than the books. Yeah, I said it.
That's rude.
Can I delist myself from this episode?
No, it's fine. It's fine. Look, this is what I'm saying though, is that I was not a big fantasy person at the time. Since then, I've read a lot more fantasy, and oddly, probably, if I looked at it on balance, more fantasy than sci-fi, which given my reading roots is a bit weird. But anyway, so that's where I came from to this. And I had no idea about any of the stuff that was being parodied in this book either. Okay. I just enjoyed the jokes because I sort of basically understood the tropes of fantasy fiction mostly from films and stuff. And in fact, I love that in this first section of the book, even he mentions Krull, and Krull was one of my favorite movies as a kid, which if you haven't seen it, it's like the best of the cheap Star Wars ripoff films because it's very science fantasy. It blends there's a lot of sort of weird sci-fi stuff in it, but it's also very much draws on Greek mythology, actually, is a big source of inspiration for Krull. Yeah, so there was a lot about this that was familiar, even though it was brand new to me. And I think that helped.
I could not stand Krull. I was just not a big fan, but I think that's because I like the Lord of the Rings thing. I came to it quite late.
But look, that's just the prologue where we find out about what kind of universe this is on a practical kind of level.
Zoologists.
Astropsychologists.
Psychologists.
To find out what they're thinking about.
There we go.
Oh, no, they had astrozoologists as well. Sorry, they had also,
They did, yeah.
And cosmochelonians. That was and chelonauts, which is what they call them when they're going. I think that comes back in The Last Hero, which is a later book in the series where, again, there's another expedition.
Do they also have pachydermatologists?
They never seem to care much about the elephants in this.
No.
I guess maybe the turtle is imagining them like the dragons.
Oh. So
that's what he's thinking about.
If he ever falls asleep,
I love it.
Then the whole disc will come crashing down.
Yeah.
Oh man, and it'll freeze because it'll move away from the sun.
I've solved it.
Good work.
Yeah,
I like it.
Do the elephants actually come into relevance in other books?
I mean, they've got names.
They do. Well, they get named in this.
They get named. Yeah.
Are you like, how does anyone know? I mean, because you never meet anyone on the disc who has alternate theories about what the turtle is named or what the elephants are named. I mean, we do meet some people deny the turtle's existence altogether, but for the most part,
on the Discworld,
but for the most part, people are sort of in agreement about those things, which is a bit weird, isn't it? Now you come to think of it.
I guess it's unambiguous. There's probably like evidence in a way that there isn't about like, because you can literally go see it.
Yeah, people have.
Whereas you can't go see the core of the earth. You just have to believe that it's there.
Well, unless you're in an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel.
And then, and then dinosaurs on the ground too.
Yeah.
Or like that girl from that video who thought that we lived inside the earth and that the sky was like the crust of the earth.
What is this?
Oh, it's just a video I saw on Twitter recently where someone's like 15-year-old sister was like, don't we live inside the earth?
Oh, it's one of those things where you find out, how does someone get to be 15 and not know this?
Yeah.
Yeah, weird. Oh, well, I'm glad that she's found out now and not later in life when it would be even more embarrassing. That's one of those things we've brought up a couple of times on the podcast about weird things you always believed until you were older. I think we're rapidly getting off.
Like in a book, Two Flower arrives in Ankh-Morpork and he has 4 eyes, but those eyes are actually glasses.
Yes, and meets the beggar Hugh.
And interestingly, I was sure there was a moment in the book where someone is horrified because he takes 2 of his eyes off. But I don't think that actually happens. Maybe it's in the Light Fantastic, or maybe I imagined it. But I kind of felt like that was in there, and that's like the payoff for the he's got 4 eyes thing.
It just assumes that he's 4 eyes. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it's not meant to be literal, as we discussed.
Yes.
Sorry, Josh Kirby fans. We just think whether or not he was trying to be clever and funny, or whether he just didn't get it, I don't know.
Yeah,
but
he got a brief. They didn't put that down
in the book. I'm pretty sure Two Flowers just got 2 eyes. Yeah. He's wearing glasses though, but yeah, it's that classic. What is now, this was obviously the first time, but it's that classic Pratchett thing where he's taken something normal from our world and put it into this crazy fantasy context. So he's taken someone who wants to go on a holiday as a tourist and put them into, Lankmar.
Yeah. And it's also the description of it, right? Because you always have this thing in fantasy where there's that discussion of people being like, well, you should just call a microwave, not a weird magic, thing powered by a destruct engine or something like that, right? But Pratchett, I think, does it really well, where I completely understood instantly what he was talking about. That waivers these days, that would be unpopular, yes? I don't know.
I guess it depends, like, because maybe it's because it's been done now.
Yeah.
There's a finite amount of being able to do that available.
Yes. It's also weird reading this one because a lot of that stuff is, like in the later books, a lot of the technology that's magical that's presented in this book is very commonplace in Ankh-Morpork. Like in the later books, everybody's got a pocket watch powered by a demon. Everybody's got, well, not everybody, but a lot of people have picture boxes that become fairly common, etc. and so on. But in this book, no one in Ankh-Morpork has ever seen a picture box. No one has ever seen a watch. No one has ever seen most of the stuff that Two Flower brings with him from the Akkadian Empire. And it's...
they're like the knockoff capital of the disc, probably. So you see it, and they're like, oh, well, I'll immediately make me some of those cheaply and sell them. Like, probably Dibbler is responsible for some of that down the line. But, yeah... I found that quite interesting.
It's a good theory. It's a good theory. I hadn't thought of that. Because we don't meet him in this book, but he's definitely there. He's definitely there somewhere.
But yeah, I reckon as soon as it's seen, someone's off being like, how can I make money from this?
Yeah. What do we think about Two Flower? Because we kind of meet him first in the book before the other protagonist.
I could not stop imagining him as John Cleese with a Hungarian phrase book.
In the sketch. Yeah. John Cleese. Yeah. My hovercraft is full of eels.
Yes, you said the non-rude one.
Yeah. I memorized a lot of the non-rude bits of Monty Python when I was in high school. I don't know. Two Flower. So you were imagining him as...
Initially, but then he just sort of settled into a small man who's just very interested in...
Well, once they get past that device of he's using a phrase book, and I love that people's like, it's a magic book. It tells him what to say.
It tells him what to say. It's great.
It's like because nobody's thought of writing down different languages.
And just the thing where he's got an exclamation mark or a question mark in quotation marks, as dialogue was fantastic because you can imagine it so well. Like we've all had those things where someone's like, what?
Yeah.
But they're not saying
But how
the
do you
word.
write it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite hard to do. Like speaking to someone who's done audio drama, those moments can be quite hard to do. Like you
Yes.
sort of go, I'm just gonna make an expression, but in a way that makes a noise, and you sort of go,
Yeah, just a yeah.
yeah, you got to really push it. But yeah, I love those bits too. And just the characters that Two Flower meets initially are ones who, by and large, I don't think we meet any of them ever again. But they are very much your sort of stock. They're very much from that world, and this is why I knew that this would be your cup of tea.
Yeah, it pulls my strings for sure.
Because this is all very clearly inspired by and a parody of Fritz.
Fritz Leiber's,
Leiber?
Fafet and the Great Mouser.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, including the city itself, which seems pretty clearly based on the city of Lankmar.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the waterworks in the Ankh, like it's got water in it.
Well, yeah, they do. I mean, there's a
It's
passing
more
reference
flowing.
that
There's
it's-
lots of reference to it, and it like is a lot more flowing than usual.
Oh, yeah, I know.
I was on Ankh Watch.
I did feel while I was reading it that this might upset you.
It didn't upset me. I was just like, what happened to it? Did the fire like glug it up? Like
Maybe they took all of the good potable water off the top to put out the massive fire, leaving just the gross stuff at the bottom.
like someone put a whole bunch of gelatin in it, or
I don't know.
and then the fire heated it up.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so one of the fan theories is that this book and its sequel take place considerably before all the other books in the series. Like 10, 20, maybe even 30 years.
Is that because of the technology?
Partly because of the technology, also because Rincewind is clear. Like we'll get to Rincewind in a minute, but he's clearly a fairly young man in this book, whereas he's consistently drawn and cast by everybody as much older, which makes no sense to me whatsoever.
No.
Because even in the later books, to be honest, he doesn't seem that old to me. Like I think he never gets older than he's about his 50s. Whereas if this is 20 years previously, he's in his 30s, so he's still a pretty young man. But I think there's a lot of things that seem to match up. And because also Ankh-Morpork is basically destroyed.
It's like the fire of London. Yeah.
And we never hear about that. So clearly it's all been sorted out by the
It's
time we
fine,
return to
yeah.
the city a few books later.
London's
mentioned-
still talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they mention it, right?
They built a whole monument.
This is just one of the things that happen. It's just a blip, and then the city keeps going.
Yeah.
But I remember reading the description of the fire, and I thought, how does it keep going, though, if the whole thing's burned down? Unless they build it up again, or is it just not burned down?
Well, I think they must have saved a considerable amount of it because there's still references in all the later books to buildings that are like hundreds of years old. And, bits of the city blow up fairly frequently, but things like Pseudopolis Yard and the Patrician's Palace and the
Pits.
Unseen University, they've all been there for a long time. They were not burned down in the fire. But
They're probably made of stone, while everything else is made of wood, kind of like the Fire of London.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I think
That makes sense.
that's good.
Yeah. But then we do meet, as Two Flower makes his way, nearly getting killed, and he's got all this massive amount of gold. He's done.
It's like 2 months' wages there. Like it barely would get him by in his wealthy home.
Yeah, and you're looking at it going, you've got like $1 million.
Yeah.
Like this is crazy. But it's amazing how little research he seems to have done. Like he's got he's got a book that tells him all of the languages, and he knows that about all the stories.
He knows the heroes and all that.
But my feeling on this is because they've strongly discouraged tourism, as we find
Yes.
out, there's not much available to him other than like the songs of sailors passing through the port, and it's revealed that he writes his own phrase book, like he compiles it himself.
Of course, yeah, that's right.
So there's no tourist infrastructure. So all he's got is the story of brave deeds and all of that kind of stuff. So I think he's done all the research that's possible in a place that's quietly like a benevolent dictatorship that doesn't have closed walls, but like
or not so benevolent as it turns out. But that's true. I found it weird the way that it's one of those things where the joke, you don't want to think too much about the joke it stops making sense, because it's hilarious to think, oh, there's a tourist on the fantasy world. But then as soon as you stop to think, why is he having all these thoughts about, I've got to do more with my life, when he lives in a society where there is no drive or thought? Because most people who feel that, that kind of traditional idea in the 50s and 60s that came in of, you've got to make lots of money and then go on a holiday. That's part and parcel of that culture.
Yeah.
Which
Go to
does
South
not
America.
exist in the Akkadian Empire or in most fantasy worlds, because everybody's sort of on subsistence. But then we don't really find out much about what the Akkadian Empire is like in this book either. There's a little hints here and there from the things that the patrician and that Two Flowers say, but we don't really.
So the
find out much
Akkadian
about
Empire
it.
is basically like Reagan, USA, going to South America tourism. Is that the kind of thing
Yeah.
I'm getting?
I think the intent, and it's perhaps unfortunate in hindsight in some ways, is that he's more like a Japanese tourist going to Australia or to Europe. There's several things about his description that sort of fit that stereotype. I mean, he also fits quite well the stereotype of the loud American tourist.
Just loud American tourist. Yeah.
So that it's this interesting sort of mixture. But then his cultural background. I mean, when we revisit it in the later book, Interesting Times, it's much more clearly China, but then there's aspects of it that are other things. So it's like anything Pratchett writes, is that even when he's inspired by something fairly specific, he tries to throw a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can really pin it down too closely.
It's hard because at the start I definitely didn't think Asia or China. Like that didn't come into my head because it was this this really affluent tourist going to basically a backwater. Just this savage place that he does not understand.
Well, it feels like he's coming from the closest thing on the Discworld to our world.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, where people have jobs and get paid a salary and have a watch and luggage and go on holidays.
Insure their property.
Yeah. Anyway, so he arrives. He gets nearly ripped off by beggars and thieves.
He does a little.
Well, he does, but he doesn't know.
Not in a ruinous way because he can afford it.
He can afford being ripped off. Yeah.
'Cause he's giving them these giant gold coins.
Made literally of gold as well.
Yeah.
Solid gold.
And he ends up in the broken drum. So called because you can't beat a broken drum. Mm-hmm. And that's when he finally meets Rincewind, the wizard. And this is, I mean, look, you know, I know we have a difference of opinion about Rincewind.
I liked him in this book.
He's good in this, isn't he? And he's quite, it's interesting because you can kind of see the DNA of what he becomes, but at the same time, he's quite a distinct character in some ways. And I really like him in this book. Like, and I enjoy him in the later books, although I have to say less as time goes on. I think that the more he changes from his roots, the less, I mean, still liked him. And I probably always will because he's my first Discworld protagonist. But I just really enjoyed him in this book.
It's probably like how Frodo loses the best parts of himself along the journey.
Yeah, I'd go with that.
It's the Sean Astin. We're coming full circle again. Yeah. There we go.
Oh, there you go.
I like that.
So don't hang out with Sean Astin.
Sean Astin. You'll lose the best part of yourself.
And then have to sail off into the distance with elves.
I'm just thinking how much easier the trip to Mount Doom would have been if Sam and Frodo had the luggage.
Oh, infinitely.
Could have just thrown the ring in there. Gollum would have gotten eaten.
You might have enjoyed Lord of the Rings too.
Yeah, I might have got more into it.
It was like the thing about they should have just used the eagles, and there's that whole theory about how
they literally could just
how that's what Gandalf was trying to tell them, like, fly, you idiots.
Yeah, fly, you fools. Oh man, so harsh. I would. Is there like a canon explanation of why they don't?
I think they just don't know about it.
I mean, apart from the fact that if they did, there'd be no novel. I mean, I would have thought that surely that would be too obvious. Like the eagles can pick them up at the end because the damage has already been done. But if they were flying to Mount Doom, they would get eaten by the horrible flying black beasts.
But I guess the eye, Nazgul.
And the eye would spot them. Like they're not very stealthy giant eagles.
Giant eagles. And they pop pretty easy too, you'd think.
There's a few of them. You could send off some distraction ones. Like, you don't know which one has the ring on it.
World War 2 bombers going with the
Anyway,
eagles.
they certainly could have gotten a lot further, a lot faster,
Yeah.
even if they'd only taken them part of the way.
Yeah.
But, again, then you wouldn't have had the journey. And it would have been the same in this book, if they hadn't decided to do some pretty dumb things and burn the city down.
That's actually just insurance fraud guy's fault, though.
That's true.
I love the fact that as soon as insurance is mentioned, fraud is mentioned instantly. Like, it just happens.
But
it's
only in
such a good-
Ankh-Morpork, because it doesn't even occur to Two Flower that someone would do
it's
that.
Never happened in his country.
Because
shocking.
You get the real sense that whatever his culture is like, it's very like they have very proper, very rigid rules. It's like everybody's like, nobody would think of breaking the laws.
Yeah, which is why he wants to see the bar fight and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, right?
Because we don't have that at home.
Yeah.
Like, I've never seen
People
a
don't fight.
And they're like, what do you mean you've never seen a fight? But Rincewind, when he's first introduced, there's several introductions. This is one of the weird things about it being broken up into 4 sections. I feel there's a fair bit of repetition in this book where things are introduced to us in more or less the same way with some of the same gags, or at least variations on the same gags 3 or 4 times. And Rincewind Rincewind gets one sort of proper introduction, and then there's a couple of other times that it's spoken about. But actually, is it worth me reading the first sort of description of Rincewind?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Look at him. Scrawny, like most wizards, and clad in a dark red robe on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. Some might have taken him for a mere apprentice enchanter who had run away from his master out of defiance, boredom, fear, and a lingering taste for heterosexuality. Yet around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the high school of magic whose time and space-transcendent campus is never precisely here or there. Graduates were usually destined for mageship at least, but Rincewind, after an unfortunate event, had left knowing only one spell and made a living of sorts around the town by capitalizing on an innate gift for languages. He avoided work as a rule, but had a quickness of wits that put his acquaintances in mind of a bright rodent. Well, the thing I like about that is just before that, it says he was watching the luggage, and then it says, watch Rincewind.
I was just about to mention that.
And I think it's like, I every time I read it, I'm not quite sure if Pratchett means he's watching the luggage, which is watching Rincewind, or if it's asking us to watch Rincewind. But I like it both ways.
So it's done beautifully, and I also had the same thing. But then later they have a description of look at him do this about someone else. So it's a technique. But I really love how it's ambiguous there.
That pulled me up because that kind of authorial voice in most it was very common in like old school sword and sorcery stuff where the author would come in and then like say, okay, this is an important thing, you should do this,
like you're being explicitly told a story
explicitly, which is fallen out of fashion quite dramatically these days. But when I first read that, I was like, oh, okay, is that deliberate? And then it appeared again later in the book. Is that a thing that appears later in the series or
not really? And
interesting.
I mean, people often talk about how different, and we have talked about how different in tone and style this book is, and it really is much closer to those older.
I wonder if that is a deliberate evocation of those books then.
He's on record as saying this is very definitely a parody and an homage to particularly Lieber and the Fuffer and the Grey Mouser books.
Yep.
But Rincewind's, how do we feel about him in this book? We said we liked him, but what do we like about him? What's different?
I think it's just he could be any of us. He's in that situation, but he's also like, oh, I could do the wrong thing. Then he tries to do the wrong thing and he fails at it. But I don't know, he's a real person. He's not a hero, and he's also roped into it. But
he says that later in the book. He says, I don't know how to be a hero.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like, there's a reference later on, like in the last part of the book, how their journey up to that point has taken them 6 months, and that he's quite a different person now than he was when they set out. And you're like, oh yeah, well that would do that to you if, like, up until that point he's just sort of been slouching around Ankh-Morpork going, well, I can't cast any spells. I'm not I'm a pretty crappy wizard, but I've got a good head for languages and I can make a bit of money.
Very good head for languages, as it turns out.
Well, he knows loads of them, but not Two Flowers language. They find another one in common, which is hilarious because there's all these things that there's some great gags about things that language doesn't have words for because it's like the language of a small community living on a bunch of islands.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I just really like him.
Rincewind feels to me like Pratchett's like Pratchett himself is the, when you were talking about the homage and that parody of sword and sorcery, he's a tourist in a sword and sorcery world. He's experiencing things that would be common to a sword and sorcery reader in the same way that Two Flowers seems to be a tourist, right? Like, he doesn't react in the way that any of these protagonists, like Elric or anything like that, right? Like, Elric is like the most anti-sword and sorcery protagonist you get within the genre, right? He's very much not a hero and all that kind of stuff. And Moorcock, that's Michael Moorcock, wrote him like that. But like Rincewind is the even more anti-sword and sorcery protagonist where he's observing the world above. And yeah, so I loved him for that reason, I think.
There's a lot of that sort of genre awareness in this book too, not just from Rincewind, but from quite a few of the other characters. Most particularly, as we'll come to know, Hrun the Barbarian, but others too. And I don't know that we need to go into too much detail about the plot of this bit. I mean, it's basically just different people trying to steal Two Flowers' gold, and plotting against them and each other, and Two Flower and Rincewind kind of bungling their way out of certain death.
After Rincewind's been forced to, he was going to escape with the money, but the patrician said, oh, well, we've got a deal with his hometown, which is that you have to look after him, otherwise they'll be mad and then they can smite us with a single nod.
Yeah, I thought that the one thing that I faulted Rincewind for in this book is that while he sort of almost gets there, he never, until quite late in the piece, and even then never quite, just comes out and says to Two Flower, you don't realize how much money you have and how much people want it here. Like,
he says it a little bit at the start. Where
I
he's
don't think Two Flower would believe him.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess so. It's so far out of his frame of reference.
Maybe Two Flower at the end of the book would believe him a little bit, because he does mature a bit towards the end.
It does seem that while he's, as we've mentioned already, his country has quite an advanced grasp of, reflected sound of underground spirits, or economics, as we finally get the payoff for that gag. Yeah. But they don't have much in the way of trade with outside parties. So there's no indication of, an exchange rate or anything. And generally in this sort of genre of fantasy, which is very much, I think the other thing why now it's so familiar to me, even more so than when I read it, is that it draws on all the same sources that Dungeons and Dragons draws on.
Absolutely,
so but there's that idea that there are no countries as such. There's city-states, and everyone makes their own coinage, and there's just sort of a general agreement that one gold coin is worth about what another gold coin is worth. Although Pratchett avoids using that kind of nomenclature and just goes for dollars and more pork.
Yep. Which again is quite sword and sorcery. Like lack of kingdoms, lack of big empires, rather more city focused.
But is that line about we've got nothing they want and they've got nothing we can afford?
Yeah.
Which I think is great.
It's like we want to buy. He couldn't buy a fish there.
Yeah,
it'd be like that'll be an eighth of a rhino.
You're
please.
right.
Like, what? Yeah. But yeah, the sort of culminating thing is that eventually, after he's been captured, because there's a bit of back and forth. So yeah, Rincewind tries to run away, gets told by the patrician, "No, you have to look after this person."
Tourism department.
The patrician then gets like a secret message from the Emperor of the Akkadian Empire saying, actually, we want you to kill him.
The vizier.
That's right. The vizier is like, no, we want you to kill him. I know I told you to keep him alive, but now we want you to kill him. And that, it's a bit full on. There's some assassins, but they don't seem to be from the Assassin's Guild. It's interesting. And look, a lot of people describe, I wasn't sure where this would come into the podcast, but a lot of people describe this book and its sequel as Pratchett sort of figuring out what he wants to do. And I actually don't feel that at all when I'm reading this book. I felt like he knew exactly what he wanted to do with this book.
Yeah.
He wanted to pay homage and write this style of fantasy and throw in some gags. But I just think he later on changed his mind about what he wanted to do. And I think Equal Rights is still probably closer to this than it is the later books. And it is that sort of between Equal Rights and Mort are sort of the transition books. But these two I felt like I was reading something from a very assured author who knew exactly what he wanted to do. It doesn't feel to me like a first novel.
No. Yeah.
And it's not. Like, it's not the first one, not the first thing he wrote.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thought, this is great. Yep. Like, it is different in style, it's different in tone. There's some character decisions that are interesting in light of where things go later. But yeah, I don't know.
It's like a pilot episode doesn't always reflect how the series is going to turn out.
Yeah, even if it's very competent and great.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, while eventually Two Flower gets captured.
Though he doesn't realize it. He's like, we're having a great time. They just really want me to come to their party.
Yeah. And Rincewind is left alone with something we haven't mentioned yet this episode, the luggage, which follows Two Flower around. And there's a big chest made out of sapient pear wood, a very, very magical form of wood that's left over from the early days of magic on the Discworld, which is something that keeps getting mentioned. That's such an old school fantasy thing to do. There's a bit of magic now, but there used to be loads.
There used to be a lot more. Yeah.
The Mage Wars.
Yeah. And the description, there's a late description of the Mage Wars later in the book, which does not match the description in Sorcery at all. But so perhaps there were two. There were two sets of them. Who knows? But yeah, the luggage is just this wonderful creation. But again, it's one of those things where the way that it's drawn, kind of like we were talking about Two Flower and his having four eyes on the cover, is not how I picture it based on the reading of the book. Like, I'm always surprised that everyone has adopted Josh Kirby's style of drawing the luggage with tiny human baby legs. I'm like, I always imagined that they would be made of wood.
Right.
Like, why are they fleshy? Like, I don't think they're described as being fleshy in the book from memory.
I also don't think, like, because it's such a competent luggage, it would be a pretty poor choice of legs. Like, if you're going to choose humanoid or like fleshy legs, you'd choose like something with hooves, perhaps.
Yeah.
Or with like monkey grips, so you could climb. You wouldn't choose human legs. They're kind of like the derpiest legs you can have.
Yes.
Yeah, particularly if they're not designed
very
to have more
versatile.
than 2 of them, for starters.
Yeah. So
It's described variously as having dozens or hundreds of little legs. So
dear little legs, according to the blurb, which I
That's-
found really
yeah.
weird.
that is not how they're described in any
Dear
other
little
place, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like if I was a magic luggage, those are not the legs I would choose for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think hooves.
Yeah.
Hooves sound like the best because I always had the image in my head when he was running. You could just hear the clip, clip, clip behind him.
Oh, that'd be
and
interesting.
that great image.
Hooves and some orangutan like
Yeah.
feet, because then you could
to
climb some stuff
grip
too.
stuff.
That'd be amazing.
There's just a few different types of feet.
'Cause I think it has difficulty climbing. That is something that does happen in the later books. Listeners, if you know any fan art where the luggage is drawn with different kinds of legs, I would love to see that because I've not seen it. But also, I mean, this is something we talked about previously too. It opens its mouth and looks at you. It's always depicted as kind of going side on. So like the face is on one of the short sides.
Yeah.
So that
The
it's,
opening's its mouth.
but then when it
Rather than a
opens
mimic
its
kind
mouth,
of
it's
idea.
sideways. Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
always figure it is more like a mimic. So
Yep.
it would make sense for it to look at you with its mouth facing you.
Yep.
But it doesn't seem to do that.
And it's got the teeth even, so...
I love that sometimes it opens and there's big teeth and it describes them as like white as the whitest birchwood or something. And then a big tongue and then it closes and then it opens again and there's just laundry. It's so good.
Yeah.
So Rincewind stuck with the luggage.
The luggage is like threatening Rincewind, basically. He's like holding him hostage until
Yeah.
he goes to rescue Two Flower because they've been out taking photos of just things in the dangerous parts, assumedly the shades. But yeah.
Yeah, including like the victims of the barroom brawl who
yeah.
Rincewind claims are all these heroes that Two Flower wanted to see.
I love that scene because that's the first mention I think of the watch in the story, and I love that he shows up and there's no reference to the dead bodies that the watch would have evidently had to walk over to get to the room, and he says, "Is everything all right here?" It's just such a good line.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's very good.
And they wait outside for the battle to be over. And you're like, oh, this is clearly the
And
watch we will
That does
later
come
know
back
and love.
later, though. Like,
Yeah, they do the same in Guards. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Yeah, everything all right here then. It's so good.
But it's during Two Flower's incarceration that he explains to Broadman, the man who owns the mended drum, what insurance
Surance,
is.
yes.
And it's that weird thing where, like, Pratchett's used the English word but made it unfamiliar to the
Yeah.
speakers so that it doesn't make any sense to them.
A
And
real
we're
old analog, yeah.
and I love the explanation that it's basically a bet. It's like, you give me some money, and it's basically a bet that nothing bad will happen
Yeah.
to your stuff.
which is true.
And if something bad does happen, I'll pay you lots of money. And Broadman goes, will you?
Will you?
But then he screws it up, and he like really does. He doesn't just burn his own
Yeah.
inn down. He burns down most of the city. And I don't think. I mean, presumably he never gets paid.
But does
No,
he?
no, he doesn't. But doesn't the insurance? Because the insurance form goes off and gets worshipped on an island.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. They lose it. Yeah,
Yeah, so
Forgotten
I-
about that.
So I guess like it wouldn't have been lodged.
It's not official.
Yeah.
Also, surely they're not so dumb as to not have a clause that says, if you
Anyone
burn your
outside
own
of
house
the-
down, we don't have to pay you. Like that's pretty standard. Like insurance
Yeah.
investigators come and check that stuff out.
But you learn through trial and error, and if no one in their society does that, they would probably not have occurred to them to
true.
put it in there.
Because there's no
Oh, that's
conflict.
true.
Yeah.
It takes one douche for you to change the things.
That's true. So he might have been the case that instigated that.
Yeah.
But also, he's insuring something that's not even in the Empire. So they'd be paying out to Ankh-Morpork,
Yeah, it does seem
which they
like
don't have trade to.
But he did pay them with their own currency.
He did, yeah.
So
Yeah. So maybe it's all right. Yeah, it's interesting. But, you know, it seems
He's
weird
an
that he would
insurance
do his
man,
job
yeah.
while he's on holiday
Yeah.
too.
And he
Surely-
seems completely happy to do it as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he is captured at the time. I guess if you
He doesn't realize that.
if you captured an accountant and threatened to kill him unless they did your taxes.
I think that's the Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it totally is. But they escape. They escape the city on horseback. Rincewind riding off with Two Flower, the luggage running behind as the city burns.
And who they meet?
Firefat and the Grey Mouser.
Well, pretty much. Brav the Hublander and the Weasel.
Weasel. Yeah.
Which is pretty close in name
Which is
as well
very
as
good.
character.
Yep.
Now, tell it, Joel. You're the most familiar among us with the Liber canon.
A little bit. It definitely flicked past my radar for the longest time. I was more of a Howard and Wagner kind of
Robert
reader.
E. Howard
Robert E.
of
Howard,
Conan
that is.
fame.
Yeah,
And-
and Carl Edward Wagner of the other Kane books.
Oh, yes.
Kane's a very popular name. I don't know if that shows up anywhere in the Pratchett Discworld. But yeah, no, Fritz Leiber's series is very classically sword and sorcery, but at the same time talks a lot about the internal genre conventions of the book. So it says it's already pushing the genre boundaries, because at that point, you know, you've got sword and sorcery, which is already, it's very dated. And then you have Leiber's work, which is pushing it as far as this genre is going to go.
And funny too. Like, he had a really good sense of humor.
Yeah, which sword and sorcery does not, generally
Yeah.
speaking.
And when we say sword and sorcery, we're talking about sort of that particular early
Very specific
kind of fantasy
subgenre,
where you have the heroes generally don't know any magic.
No.
It's fairly low magic, but again, there's that idea we talked about where there was a lot of magic, now there's not much.
Magic is usually bad.
Yeah,
or
usually people who do
corrupting.
magic are like worshipping evil gods or,
Yep.
you know, summoning evil powers. And there's a lot of reliance on, you know, just raw cunning, and the heroes are very often a bit grey in them, or not, if not grey in their morals, like often just out for themselves. Like, they're not traditional heroes in that sense of I must save people because it's the right thing to do.
And yeah, it's definitely born out of that Howardian era of America, self-reliance, you know, a hero eschewing civilization. So civilization is very bad and the wilds are good. So you'll never see them, you know, mingling very fondly with city folk.
Oh,
You know,
yeah,
that's always the enemy.
They go in the city and it's a hive of scum and villainy.
Scum and villainy.
I mean, Star Wars also draws on that. A lot of that
Absolutely.
stuff.
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley does too.
Yep.
But he does a bit of a flip-flop later in his life because of his own personal circumstance.
Yes.
But yeah.
There's an anti-sort of city message in Brave New World.
Hugely. And it's
Yeah.
like in Our Year of the Ford, like they
Yeah.
sort of talk about, yeah. But then later he dies in America loving drugs. Like, it's just,
Yes, it's
Yeah.
a big switch.
I mean, I guess it showed he was open-minded and welcome to be, I don't know. We'll do the Huxley podcast another time.
Yeah, for
we can
sure.
contrast that with the Lovecraft podcast as well.
That'll be great. Like, yeah, I'll put up pictures on my Huxley
Yeah,
shelf.
speak
I've
of
got 5
open-mindedness.
copies of Brave New World.
And look, this whole section, in fact, is kind of told in flashback, really, to these two characters as Rincewind meets them. And Rincewind knows them. And that's something else about him that's quite different in this book, is that he knows all these characters. He's kind of very well known to the heroes that pass through Ankh-Morpork, probably because they're the people most likely to need to make, you know, the acquaintance of someone who knows a lot of languages, because they're going to be coming up to him with like strange manuscripts and amulets and some person they've rescued whose language they
Yeah.
don't speak. And they're like, can you help me with this guy? And he's like, yeah, all right, but I don't want to get too involved. Just pay me some money. And like, what an interesting character. I'm very curious about what kind of adventures Pratchett might have imagined Rincewind had had up to this point.
Yes.
Because he would have been much more peripherally involved, but still doing some weird stuff.
So I'm so sorry to bring it back to Lord of the Rings, but I feel like in this book, Rincewind is on a Bilbo trajectory, and then later on he sort of veers into Frodo territory.
How would you characterize the difference between those two?
So Bilbo's journey was less intense. It was like the fun adventure that you have, and then you go back and you live your quiet life in the Shire.
Yeah.
And so he kind of had that big thing, and then he could settle down. Frodo had the big traumatic epic thing that broke him completely. And even when he got home, it
Not
wasn't
fully whole.
it wasn't the home that he remembered, because it had also been touched by the whole war.
Yes.
And so it's different. Like it's almost as though he'd heard, like, is it Uncle Bilbo? Like that's their
Yeah.
He'd heard Uncle Bilbo's adventures and sort of wanted that his whole life, but the one he had was not the same. And so it very much broke him. So there's difference between a children's book and an
Yes.
adult's book.
Yeah.
Basically. So he starts off as a sort of with the potential to be a Bilbo, but he turns into a Frodo
Yeah.
And do you think that happens in this book, or is it more
later. I
later?
think
Yeah.
maybe if they'd stopped one adventure earlier, he would have just happily Bilbo'd
Yes,
off.
that would have been a Bilbo. Yeah,
But
for
yeah,
sure.
but
Yeah.
this sets him off to Frodo territory.
Yeah. I mean, even in the next section, which we're about to get to, the Sending of Eight, that's when it sort of, you know, he starts to face horror. Like in the first section, he is, as you say, he's having like
Eldritch
certainly
horror.
some bad things happen to him in the first one, but he's still having what could essentially be a fun adventure when he's had a chance to sit down and sort of get over it a bit. But yeah, in the second section, it's not like that at all. It's like there's an eldritch horror from beyond the veil of time, and
Yeah.
it's nearly going to eat you.
But he could have recovered from that, I think, but then just the other things.
No. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
It's a downward spiral at that point.
yeah, and that, I mean,
Or upward.
hard to say.
It's very much like the Diana Wynne Jones book Homeward Bounders, where it's just it's a fantastic book, very underrated. You should read it. It's very Dungeons and Dragons, the whole thing. So
Oh wow, okay, I'm putting that on my list.
it's fantastic. You'll love it.
Yeah, okay, all right. It's not the first Wynne Jones book that's been recommended to me either, so I really,
they're all
I really
good.
need to get into her.
This is a good entry point for you, I think.
Okay, all right, I'm into it. But yeah, they're in the home of the gods, Dun Manifestin.
Yep.
Which is I still love that joke. I'm so glad he kept it. There's so many things he sort of just let go after this first book. That
I didn't get that. That's the first time I'm understanding.
oh really? Yeah. So
How many years old were you when you?
when you realised Dun Manifestin was the gods version of Dun Roman. Yeah. This is one of those times where we meet the pantheon of Pratchett gods for the Discworld, and they're so like
What a motley crew.
a bit of like they're essentially kind of Greek pantheon.
Except for the god of slight breezes.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
but
how
then
did he
there's-
get in? Like, who invited Zephyr?
Well, you know, Zephyr was an actual god.
But like, isn't that still
in our-
funny?
Well, yeah, that's true.
Because he's not even like thunderstorms or whatever. He's just
Yeah.
a slight breeze.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
It's like someone's +1 who just ended up on the
Yes.
list
Yeah.
for like ever and just sort of keep coming for the fancy
He
events.
stands near the door.
Yeah.
he just somehow got a membership. It's a technicality.
He's like one letter away from someone who's actually supposed to be there.
He's like his mum or his dad was a member.
Yeah.
he got in on a family
Yep.
thing. Yeah, and this is they're playing games with the people on the disc, and it reminded me a lot of the original Clash of the Titans film. They're playing this game on. They've got a big game board, and they put the little characters down. They move them around. Also reminded me of what Barusa does in the Five Doctors, the 20th anniversary Doctor Who special. The Doctor gets kidnapped out of space and time, and so do his like old companions, and sent to the death zone on Gallifrey, where they have to fight their way through all these like horrible monsters, because the current president of the Time Lords wants to discover the secret of immortality. But he does it, not only does he capture them, but the thing that he uses to capture them creates a little miniature of them, and then he puts it on his Dungeons and Dragons table and moves it around with a stick. And it's hilarious, because I'm like, oh, he's got a miniature making machine. He's essentially got like before we invented them on Earth, a 3D printer.
Yeah.
But it's very silly.
That's so greedy that he wants to be immortal. He lives for long enough.
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? But he's gone mad with power. There's the thing. And the Doctor's very disappointed because
Time Lords don't go mad with power.
No, who would ever?
That never happens.
Never happened.
They're masters of their own fate.
But as a kid, to have your own miniature making machine.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, what a power trip. that
Oh,
would
the
be.
crap things I would have like made in miniature.
Yeah.
I wanted the ones from the show. I was like, yeah, I'll have the first 5 Doctors as
Yeah.
little toys, please, and like their friends. And anyway,
Do they sell those? Because that does seem like a real strong merch
That's
push,
a
kind of
good-
like
Yeah.
they sell
second Star Wars.
I don't know that they've
Harry
ever
Potter
sold
it
the
up.
ones from the TV show. I would.
We've
love
got
that.
3D printers now. We can make our own.
It's true. It's
Yeah.
true. You just have to.
Design. I don't know how it
Design
works.
and work on it. Which
Can
sounds
someone
awful.
just upgrade them so that you can hook up your brain, imagine the thing, and then print it out?
I
That
like
would
that.
be the
That's a Philip K. Dick
Yeah.
story right there.
yeah. But then in Philip K. Dick stories, okay, that's a separate.
They'd be
podcast.
alive, wouldn't they? The 3D printer would print a living thing.
Yeah.
And they'd also print ads, and you'd be living in your own hell of ads.
Yeah.
And it's also a government conspiracy for like something, and also it'd end really abruptly because you got to churn out those short stories really quick.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I love Philip K. Dick, even though I just disparaged him
Yeah.
a whole lot.
Oh,
But
he's great.
He's great. No,
I'd actually never read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep until very recently.
that's so
Right.
good, right?
And I was reading the bit at the start with the emotion organ.
Basically, like Blade Runner is a whole different story.
Yes.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
great, but it's a completely different story.
Yeah, it takes elements of it, but they are complementary texts,
Yep.
not adaptation. Or adaptation, but not in a I'm putting the story on screen
Yes.
way.
And, in a similar way, the Sending of Eight is kind of a completely different story to The Colour of Magic, because we have these gods that sort of appear out of nowhere. We haven't met them yet, and now they're playing something that's like not quite chess. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons is what they're doing. And this is what, once you've played Dungeons and Dragons and you read or see any one of these stories where the gods are playing with the lives of mortals, you're like, you're role playing.
Yeah,
that's what
role-playing.
you're doing.
Yep.
But you're playing it in
You
an
nerd.
adversarial way, which is a weird thing to do. And 2 of the players are Fate, clearly the god of fate, and the lady whose name is never mentioned but is clearly Lady Luck.
Yes.
You're not allowed to say her name,
Or she will disappear.
You just don't have any.
She's classically fickle.
And she has picked as her heroes an idiot wizard and a tourist.
Because she's got a soft spot for the underdog.
And, I think that they have nothing going for them except they are fortunate. But they basically almost immediately run into trouble because as they go into a forest, Fate plonks down his, killer piece that he's like brought out of a special box, and everyone's like, how did you get... It also reminds me of like X-Wing or one of those modern collectible miniatures games where...
The very rich nerd.
Yeah, the rich nerd's got, I've bought like an entire Star Destroyer.
Yeah. And he didn't paint it himself either.
No, he's paid someone else to paint it. Yeah, absolutely. And he brings out this representation of this weird 8-legged thing, which is
all suckers and tentacles.
The eldritch horror from Beyond the Dawn of Time. And this becomes very much a Lovecraft short story with gags and a sort of bit of swords and sorcery thrown in.
Absolutely. A lot of Conan, for sure.
Loving the talking sword in this section, though.
Oh, Kring.
Yeah.
He's very sassy.
But he's also like, he's like the old... like war dog who's just been like, hear my boring stories that are actually really exciting but told in a really boring way.
Yeah. Because he's so old as well. Like he's been around for thousands of years.
You might have noticed the nick about third of the way up my blade. Just sort of going to tell you about the war thing. And it's just, it's the people who tell exciting stories so dully.
Yeah.
With this section too, like as well as having Kring the Magical Sword, it's the first of many times throughout the rest of the book where the characters stumble into an area that is suffused with magic when the rest of the Discworld is supposedly a bit more bereft of it, because they go into this enchanted forest while trying to escape some pursuers. Rincewind climbs up this tree and accidentally damages it, which means he gets pulled inside it, and it's a whole other sort of dimension where the Dryads live. So, which is, that's an interesting thing. It's like basically the Dryads have
Pocket
a TARDIS,
dimension.
which is shaped like a tree. And they're going to kill him because he's damaged the tree. But first of all, they're going to like make him watch Two Flower get eaten alive by the cosmic horror that is Bel Shahamroth.
Yeah.
Which they worship.
Which caught me off guard.
I was like, but why would you worship this thing?
There's the nature thing, and then there's the cosmic eldritch horror next door.
Kind of like a big spider, so maybe it's like a nature thing together.
I guess so. I mean, I like that there's all these like pictures of like 8-legged creatures.
Sorry, what was that number?
Oh. 7. There are all these creatures that have more than 7 but fewer than 9 legs. And I like that he specifies that wizards can't say that number because they're innately magical, and so Rincewind's dorm room was room 7A. And they've got these little euphemisms like 2 times 4. But there's all these creatures, and it gives him an excuse to do his first bit of sort of weird disc cryptozoology, because he's got that Octasia, which is like I imagine like it's one of those lemurs with big eyes but 8 arms. Sorry, twice 4 arms, and it's too late now.
It's gone.
It's coming.
He's
it's coming
already,
for us.
It's gonna, like, these leaves in the middle of my table are just going to explode, and it's going to come out of the middle,
like Jumanji.
Yeah. Rincewind manages to jump through the portal that the Dryads are opening so that they can watch Two Flower get eaten.
Just get a TV.
Get an imp.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all you need.
Two Flower has just wandered there because he's like, there seems to be some signs telling me to go there. And even the wolves in the forest that were chasing them earlier are like not dumb enough to go there. And then they say the number. Although it's Kring the sword that says it first.
Why can't you say it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, why can't he say 8?
Yeah.
Why doesn't he know why he can't say 8 if
Yeah.
he's thousands of years old and his magical sword? I guess he's getting forgetful.
Yeah.
That's plausible.
Or he's just dying for a bit more adventure and he does it on purpose.
Maybe.
Yeah, he wants to slice up some tentacles.
Pretty sure like a sword can't die, so
Yeah.
what's the risk to him? He might have to sit at the
gets
bottom of a
lost
lake
forever.
for a while.
That sounds even more boring.
True. It's boring, but like
He's good at boring.
yeah.
Yeah, he can
Also,
handle it.
also a note on the temple, because that's like very classic. Conan stumbles on a weird temple in the middle of nowhere. Why is it there? Who knows? It's there.
It was worshipped in ancient times.
When magic was
others.
very common.
This is a remnant of the evil gods of magic.
Yeah, I was imagining it as the Winchester Mystery House, like that, like super haunted house, because it's got the number of things, like the repeated motif of like 2 times 4.
The repetition,
and it's kind of like the avoiding number of the beast. But in the Winchester Mystery House, number 13 is used in all of the architecture. So I was kind of like, it's kind of like that, where there's just like repetition of the number.
All right. That's interesting. Yeah, because there's lots of little details that kind of like in Lovecraft, who's always trying to describe things that cannot be, you know, when he's talking about non-Euclidean angles and, you know, cyclopean architecture. They mentioned that the temple is like tiled with tessellated octagons, and you're like, you can't tessellate octagons, not like regular ones anyway. But like, yeah, it's sort of left up to your imagination.
The classic Lovecraftian method of jamming words together violently enough to produce a sentence. Yeah, which is thankfully avoided here.
Now, I also always get this god's name wrong. I realize
I wrote it down
because I always say Bel Shahamroth, but that's not right. It's Bel Shaharoth or
Shamharoth.
Shamharoth. Yeah, so he's a bit of a sham, but he's not really described except that he's got all these tentacles and a big eye. And so he actually reminds me, or it actually reminds me more than anything else, of Shumagorath, which is this character from Marvel Comics, who I only really know because he was weird, like a fairly obscure character from Marvel Comics. Yeah, and he's basically a giant eyeball, but with massive tentacles, who's like an elder being that's evil. And but
straight up B-villain.
Yeah, but he appears in the fighting game Marvel vs. Capcom as a playable character. Like, so all the other characters like superheroes and supervillains that you've heard of with like arms and legs and like superpowers, and then there's like a eyeball with tentacles.
You know, there was one designer on that team that was super passionate about putting him in.
Yeah.
It's just like, let's do it.
We need a giant eyeball.
Well, it just sounds like all of the bad things from Lord of the Rings. It's like Shelob plus the eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. It's just, they're so down on things that have more than 7 but fewer than 9 legs. A lot of my favorite creatures have that number of legs. I love spiders and cephalopods. I love them. They're so great. Anyway, I
even in Australia, like, I mean, if you live somewhere where they weren't like out to murder
you
but they're not
in your
out
bed.
Look,
they're out to defend themselves.
Not out to murder us. It's just that if you know, force them to bite you by
rolling over,
hassling them or squashing them, then you might die. But
like,
not.
Why are they so poisonous? Like, because it can't be like a kangaroo's that vicious.
Well,
just drop
that's a good question, actually. But they escaped the clutches of Bel Shamharoth, thanks to the salamanders.
Yeah, and I was because
overexposure.
Yeah, but also he's the soul stealer, right? And they have that line about cameras taking pictures, stealing a part of your soul. Is that why it defeats the soul stealer? Because taking a picture of it?
I had never thought of that. That is so good.
Right, because the reference is right at the start of the book, and then it pays off in the middle. Yeah,
that's intentional.
That's great.
It's got to be.
Because it was the light, but also I was like, it's like holding a mirror up to the...
Yeah.
Although my
basilisk.
my favorite part is right at the end of that, where they sort of convince Ron to sort of keep looking after them because they'll take all these photos of him, which is like, this is amazing. But then Two Flower Hands Rincewind the photo. I thought you might like to see this picture, and he's like, it's got a blurry thumb in front of the monster, and Rincewind just says, "Well, that pretty much sums up my life." That's my favorite moment of the book right there. That's so good,
and that's something that makes me just really love the Rincewind in this book more because it's just so matter of fact about it. It's like, it's fine.
He just becomes sort of more. I mean, look, I'll be interested to revisit his later books because so far what we've read is we've really only read for him Sorcery and Eric, and that's very sort of that middle period of him, and he's going to come back in the interesting times, and it's going to be, I think, quite interesting to see what he's like in that book. But
interesting times indeed.
Yeah, because in this book he's great. In those books he's sort of good. I actually really like him in Sorcery as well, but he's a lot more petulant. He's a lot more like, this isn't fair. Whereas in this book, he's not got time for that. He understands the gravity of his situation, and he's not yet complaining about how this shit always happens to him.
He complains a lot more towards the end of the book rather than the start and the middle.
Because he's been going for like 6 months, I guess, and it's like at the beginning he's like, "Oh, this is unusual for me," but then later on it's like his life is like this.
Yeah.
It's all turned for the worse since he met Two Flower. It's just gone downhill. It's a wonder that he calls him a friend.
He should have just stuck in that alternate reality where he's a Swedish like academic doctor, and it's fine.
Oh, we're coming up to that.
Yeah, we are.
What a strange bit.
But if the first part is Fritz Lieber and the second part is H.P. Lovecraft, the third part is clearly Anne McCaffrey.
Yes,
because this is where it's all dragons all the time. And people who ride them and hang out with them. But there's some cool, again though, even though he's doing these things where he's clearly doing homage or parody of other writers, he's also putting his own interesting stuff in there. Like I love in the Wormberg, which is this sort of weird inverted iceberg of a stone monolith, and there's a big sort of hollow inside it where the dragons hang out.
Literally.
Yeah, they have these massive steel rings, and then there's all these little steel rings that they wear these hook boots to
the
walk
hook
along
boots.
the ceiling
Yeah.
to get to them. I'm like, that's so weird, but so great.
Yeah.
I really liked that. And
The
clearly-
strangest hanger in history.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, that was I liked that. And it's it's the idea that he comes back to in Guards, that the dragons can't really exist normally. They have to be fueled by human imagination and magic.
So here's a weird vibe as well that I got from this that I probably imagine 2 other people in the world would have got from this, which was the really strange, weird animated movie by Ralph Bakshi,
Oh, the dragon.
Fire and Ice.
Oh, no, I was thinking of a different one. Yeah.
Right. So Fire and Ice, there's this giant glacier with a hole in the top of it, and you have this old, well, not that old, but he's got gray hair, so it assumes he's quite old. Guy called Necron, and he has a very striking resemblance to the old man in the Wurmberg.
Oh, yeah.
And and also the general lack of clothing as well in the iceberg, the very, very cold iceberg. Like, again, very classic sword and sorcery. You're in the middle of the Arctic. You've got no clothes, but they're fine. No goosebumps.
Is it like imagination to keep them warm?
Yes, absolutely. I like that.
You can imagine dragons. You can imagine the
clothing.
cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
you just
guess
don't
so.
see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. It's like that Doctor Who episode after the 50th anniversary where they, for no good reason, are like, well, you have to go naked into this church, but you're allowed to wear hologram clothes so
Yeah.
that no one can see that you're naked. You're like, what is the point of this?
Yeah.
But yeah, so we meet the protagonist. So there is the Dragon Lord who's dead. And then there's his 3 children, Liesa Dragon Lady, who's very directly named after one of Anne McCaffrey's protagonists.
Yes.
Whose name is like Lesser or something.
Yeah, we have a very similar thing with Chimera in Conan as well, with the taking of the name Conan.
Yeah.
So the Chimerian, and in this one it's Cimmeria. I think.
Well, they also they mentioned the land of Chimera.
Yeah,
at
Chimera.
one
That's
point.
the one. That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Chimera. But yeah, it's very. Oh yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about this section, Liz?
I don't know. Like it's hard to because I did read some Anne McCaffrey when I was younger, but I've seen so much more Game of Thrones, so I could not.
So you could not get the image.
Yeah, so it was very much like stop imagining Daenerys. Stop imagining Daenerys. Stop. So like I just basically pictured Emilia Clarke because it was like Daenerys with brown hair.
Yeah.
But
And a lot of brown hair. She's supposed to have lots of hair. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not practical if you're riding around on dragons, surely.
if they're dragons of your imagination, then surely your hair should be fine.
I guess so.
But no clothes and long hair. Classic.
Yeah. I liked how tough she was in terms of like she wanted to take on her brother. She was very decisive, and I liked how her dad was affectionate. That this is the child of mine that had the the steel to kill me.
Yep.
Like that's why he likes her the best. So
And she has the best
Good
power
on
of
you.
summoning
Yeah.
the dragons as well.
But I was a bit sad that she was not as good as her dad at imagining dragons. Like, he could have been lying. He could have been like, "Oh, back in my day, I could imagine 500 dragons."
Yeah.
But
And he was just being a jerk to Two Flower. I love that Two Flower can imagine a dragon.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite parts.
because he's a dreamer, that's his whole thing. That's why he's the only one of his people
Yes.
to go away. So
And the only one on the whole disc to go, I'm going to go on a holiday somewhere else just for fun.
Exactly.
And see all these amazing things. And that was his whole impetus, was all these fantasy stories that he'd read.
And now he's living it. Yeah.
Yeah, except that he knew that they were real in a far off place, so he wants to go see them. And that, and he'd read about dragons. Then there's that great line where he's like, a world that didn't actually include dragons seemed like a pretty poor sort of world to him. And I also liked that when he accidentally summons a dragon, because in this place, if you really believe, or if you can imagine strongly enough, because they kind of also say that Liesa doesn't really believe in the dragons. She just sort of does it because she knows she can.
Yeah.
But Two Flower really does believe down in his heart that dragons should be real. And so he imagines one, and it's not like the sort of little functional ones that Liesa imagines. It's like a massive green, like I was imagining like Elliot from like Pete's Dragon.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
This atypical dragon.
and it's super polite.
So I was imagining, this massive green, awesome dragon. And again, shades of D&D, like when he's describing the dragons hanging out in the roost, Pratchett's writing about how they're black and white and green and red. And I'm like, all the colours of Dungeons and Dragons dragons.
And that's kind of like Joel's earlier point about how Two Flower is almost an analog for Pratchett himself at some points, because he comes in knowing all this sci-fi fantasy stuff. and he's the one with the very good imagination who
brings
comes
it
up
into the
with
world, yeah.
dragons. So, and another point on Liesa, she's kind of like the person who inherits the family business. She wants the money, but she's not like passionate about building it up from like like an apple cart to like a big fruit empire.
Yeah.
Whereas
she's good at it,
Yeah.
but doesn't really care about it.
there isn't
There's
the
no
spark
passion.
at the bottom, which is why her dragons are so crap.
Yeah. I liked how utilitarian she was about Hrun as well.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, we'll catch
fulfill
these
purpose,
guys, and
yeah.
the biggest one might be strong enough to like be useful in my conquest of this land, and if he's crap, I'll just let the dragons eat him. But then she sees him, and he's like, oh, you're a bit of a babe.
And her 3 tests are very much like very to the point.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah, it's like 1, you're alert enough that I can't kill you. 2, you've subdued my 2 brothers. 3, well, we
Chemistry.
don't explicitly say what it is, but we're going to get it on. I love it. And it is quite, I think we got a question on Twitter about how this book was more salacious and what was the word? Libidinous than other Pratchett. And there is like, there's certainly more implied sex in this book.
It's playing to the Conan vibe, absolutely, in this section. Yeah.
And I kind of like Hrun's internal monologue, though, where he's like, look, normally I rescue like these beautiful maidens and we hang out for a bit, and then I sort
Then
of
we just
settle them
off.
down somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm getting on with it. I don't know
on
if
to
you
the
know,
next
but I'm
one.
part of a traveling narrative, so I can't settle down or the story ends.
And that question was from Ian Nichols.
Oh, thank you. And I think, yeah, absolutely it is. But also, in some ways, I mean, like in later books, like when Carrot and Angua, who are 2 of the characters from the Watch series, when they get it on one of the books, it just says the bed springs went gloink.
Which, again, seems too salacious.
I know, it seems a bit. But Pratchett's characters do have a life below the waist, to steal a phrase from the Death by Books podcast.
Well, and he describes Hrun as priapetic at one point or something like that as well. And I'm like, oh no.
Oh, dear.
That's so visual.
Yeah.
Well, also it like switches the dynamic here, because it's not Hrun's story. It's Liesa's story in one sense, because she's the one making the decisions in this particular scene. In Conan, it's the rescue, whereas in this one, she's planning the whole thing out.
Yeah. But Hrun, like Conan, is very much, he doesn't usually set out to have a specific adventure.
No, it
He's
just
sort of
happens.
roaming, and he comes across something and just goes, all right, I'll run with this.
It's the man in the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like he was saying, like, when Two Flower, when they're in the dungeon, says, oh, what do you think is going to happen? He's like, oh, well, they'll probably burst in and put us in an arena. Then I'll have to fight, like, these 2 things and an 8-foot person. And then I'll find a servant girl who'll show me the way out of the thing. It's like, is that how it usually happens? He's like, yeah, that's
It's very matter of fact.
That's pretty much my life, yeah.
This is how it goes.
I've done this once or twice. And you're like, oh, okay. You can just see, like, he's clearly like at least a 10th level barbarian, you know?
Yeah.
Which actually, the one thing I haven't mentioned, because we're getting up to the bit where Rincewind almost casts his one spell, and they mention, again, this is something we've talked about before in the early books, there's a lot of stuff that is clearly from both Dungeons and Dragons and the tradition, because Rincewind talks about, he spends a lot of time, particularly in the first and second parts of this book, complaining about how crap magic is, because you have to spend all this time memorizing your spells.
Memorization, yeah.
Which is the Jack Vance, like Dying Earth series style magic, where you have to read a book and you memorize the spell, but once you cast it, the memory of the spell goes out of your mind with the magic, and that's what powers it. So then you have to read the spell and memorize it again, which is how magic works in the earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons.
So it's kind of like how studying for exams works.
Yeah. You put all this knowledge in your brain. That's great. You power your score in the exam, and then you don't need to know that anymore.
It's unimportant. Yeah.
And he just talks about how much that sucks, because he's like, yeah, and he's like, can't you like turn into an animal? He's like, no, that's like an 8th level spell. And he says 8th level spell. He doesn't say 7th, 8th level spell. But he's like, and it would take like 4 days to memorize it, and then you cast it, and then you just have to do that again. And I'm like, yeah, that does sound crap. Like it takes all the fun out of magic.
He's also like a better person than I think a lot of people would be, because like he's been in some pretty life-threatening situations, and he hasn't been like tempted enough to just do the spell and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not until he's very definitely going to die falling from a great height, because Two Flower rescues them from the top of the Wormberg, which is the magical worm dragon place, where the Liesa's got Hrun fighting her 2 brothers who are on dragons. And Two Flower takes his dragon, which has busted him out of the prison, and he picks up Rincewind and Hrun. Hrun doesn't really want to go. He's like, no, I'm on a good thing here. But then they fly off, and they're being chased by the other dragons, and they fly so high that they run out of air. the air gets too thin and Two Flower passes out, at which point he's no longer imagining his dragon, who he names after his master, who's called Nine Reeds. I thought that was great that he named it after the person who trained him as an accountant. But then, yeah, because he passes out, the dragon disappears and the three of them drop out of the sky. And Liesa rescues Hrun because she needs him for her plans. And then, the other two are just plummeting towards Earth. They're going to die. And actually, it's earlier than that Rincewind says the spell, because it's when he's rescued by Two Flower that he stops saying it. But now they're plummeting towards Earth. And then, for no really apparently described reason, they suddenly switch into another plane of existence.
Yeah.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
And they find themselves aboard an actual aeroplane.
And one of them's Swedish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rincewind. Doctor.
Yeah.
Although it's
doctor,
meant to,
yeah.
it doesn't actually mean anything in any language. It's
No.
like, it's just sort of meant to sound a bit foreign. I always thought, when I read it when I was young, I always thought it sounded vaguely Indian. Because I'd not heard a lot of Indian names.
Yes, I had the same thought.
And I was like, where is this? I don't know. But it's just meant to sound foreign.
IJ, I think, is the one that does it.
And Jack Zweiblümen.
Yeah. Very German. Or is it German or Dutch? I'm not sure. But yeah, they find themselves this alternate existence and are briefly confused and think they've been eaten by a dragon and they're inside it. You know, I always remembered that this happens in the book. But when I got up to this bit, I was like, he's disarming a hijacker.
Yeah, there's a bomb.
And that was very topical in the 80s.
Yeah.
Like, there was a lot of hijacking of planes going on in
Yes.
the late 70s and early 80s. I was like, wow. And the cabin crew were like, oh, that was very brave.
Yeah.
It's like, I didn't even realize I was doing it.
I was like, have I missed something?
Yes, I had. Yep.
And so I went back over and I was like, I have, but I can't find it.
Yes. I had the exact same thought. I went into it and I said, wait a minute, maybe I've just blurred my way through 2 pages and I haven't figured this out. And I was like, oh no, I have still no idea what's happening. So, yeah, right up until the end of that section, I was like, oh, I get it. And then it was over. And then I'm like, well, did I?
Yeah. I mean, I always thought, and it kind of, when you read it back, I don't know if it's really supported by the text, but I always thought this was a residual effect of him almost casting the spell. And that the magic of that sort of had lingered around and then had finally taken effect. But there's the book doesn't really describe that or give a reason why they are suddenly transported into an alternate universe where simultaneously they've just arrived but also have always existed as these other
they've always
versions
been
of
there,
themselves, and then suddenly pop back into existence in the Discworld a little bit later when they're closer to the ground and many thousands of miles away over the ocean.
Yeah.
And it was cute. But again, I don't think he really rationalizes it.
Yeah.
Thin air
it's-
hallucination, like they were up in the
Up in the
atmosphere.
air.
But
Oh, yeah. Although then, why are they still alive if it was only hallucination? Because they should have smashed to death on the ground. But who knows?
Is that
Who
also
knows?
a recurring thing in the Discworld? The inclusions of real world?
no.
No, this
pretty
is
much-
very
yeah.
out of there.
There's, I
Right.
mean, there's little references to things like there's often ideas from the real world that pop up.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and there's one point where Rincewind says to Two Flower, "This is another fine mess you've got me into,"
Yeah.
and it's clearly a thought that's come from somewhere else.
Yeah.
and that is very common, but
Yep.
not this actual physical intrusion into our world. That has never happened before or since. Well, there is no before. It's never happened since this book. Or unless it maybe happens in the Light Fantastic. Again.
Time is a flat circle.
Stop saying that on the podcast.
No.
I only know what
Every
it is.
episode.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, it's or a flat disc.
You can just like keep editing them out and I'll keep saying it.
Yeah.
No, I would never edit it out. But yeah, it's weird and it's fun, and it doesn't necessarily. I think from a narrative sense, he doesn't really justify it, but from a fun sense, I think it fully is. And this is something like that during certain eras of Doctor Who. On my old Doctor Who podcast, we would talk about where sometimes maybe it doesn't necessarily make logical or narrative sense, but it makes emotional sense. And this, I don't think makes emotional sense, but it makes comedy sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's a funny thing to do, and it's weird and more weird because I think the comedy in this book is there, and there's some great gags, but there's not as many as in the sort of subsequent books, which really sort of, like the early ones after this really ramp up the gags quite a lot, and then it kind of settles down a little bit. But it is funny in the sense that it's weird.
It's also another situation they get themselves in, which I think is the wonder why he put it in there. Maybe it's just like, oh, this is just another thing that happens to these two unfortunates. And it's also incredibly specific, right? Like it says, all of this, however, totally lost on Dr. Reginswand, 33, a bachelor, born in Sweden, raised in New Jersey. That was the point in which it lost me, where I was like, oh, he's using the names, not just simply referring to the plane or anything, but very specifically the names. But yeah, very strange.
33. Does
Yeah.
that give us an...
Well, yeah,
'cause
I suspect he's the same age, so that
Yeah.
makes sense to me that he is in his early 30s. And that's how I always imagined him. And when I was in my early 30s, which is...
You were also a wizard dressed in red.
Well, I felt
and
like...
you kept having to lead magical tourists around. They kept giving you gold
yeah,
coins.
I could imagine Ben.
It was more that...
And they imagined you a dragon. And
It's more that I really wanted to play the character. I thought it would be fun. And I still have... Look, I've said
you'd be
this in a
great.
previous episode. I would love to play Rincewind. There is like... he doesn't appear in most of the plays because he's not in most of the books. But there is there's a version of his first 3 stories. So this one, The Light Fantastic and Sorcery, which I sort of edited together, and it's called The Rinse Cycle. And I'm like, I would love to do that. I don't know. And I always thought of him as being a bit older than me when I was, around the time I was thinking about that. I mean, I'm preempting another question, but we won't have time for all of them, so I might as well. Someone else did ask, what did we think of David Jason in the Colour of Magic telemovie? It's kind of a miniseries / telemovie because it was in 2 parts, and it combines both this and the second novel together. And David Jason was cast as Rincewind.
this was from Tara Atkinson.
Thank you, Tara, for the question. I actually have not watched it, and the main reason is that I just think it's the worst casting ever. Like, David Jason is funny. I enjoyed his work as a young man because he's the voice of Danger Mouse, and I love Danger Mouse.
Oh, wow.
So he's clearly got a good comic timing, and he's great as Albert in Hogfather, but he's just way too old, and he's just not right for the character. And I was just like, I can't... Like, it changes the character so much for him to be an old man.
Like a funny Gandalf. That's a bit silly.
Yeah, and I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, and I assume that they've done that because they cast Sean Astin as Two-Flower, that they wanted that kind of, well, we want a Gandalf-style character to go with our Hobbit-style character. And
Oh, dear.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, that's not a
And they'd already
reason.
cast... I also thought it was just totally weird because they'd already cast David Jason as a totally different character.
It makes more sense for them to be contemporaries in age, though, as well.
Yeah, because they become buddies. And
Yeah.
also, they have to run around and ride horses and escape from things. And Rincewind, at no point in the books, not even in the later ones, is like, I'm too old for this shit.
yeah.
Like, he never says that. He's just like, this isn't fair, rather than, I can't believe this has been happening to me for 40 years. So...
Yeah, he doesn't constantly refer to arthritis. He's completely fine.
Yeah, I don't think you can age a character by, 30 years and just keep them the same. So I think that's a weird thing to do, and that's why I haven't watched it. I do want to watch it because I do love Sean Astin, and I do really like Hogfather, and particularly going postal. I thought they were actually really good. So I should watch it, but I mean... probably we'll watch it and we'll do an episode of the podcast about those shows at some point.
Before we get into the final section, I do have a question about Rincewind that I wanted to flag, and I think it's a good time because they talk about his real-world version as well. And as a side point to that, I think the fact that he is Swedish and raised in New Jersey is a step towards explaining his language skills. But
Multilingual.
throughout the whole thing, he's complaining about, he's not really cut out to be a wizard, and all the things that Two-Flower is talking about sort of hints at science and logic, and it seems like he would have a much greater affinity for that. So my query was, if he existed in the real world, who do you think he'd be? What would he do? Beyond, I think that's a good interpretation. It's not an interpretation. Terry Pratchett can choose what he wants to do with his characters.
Yeah.
But it seems like he exists in a world where his field isn't quite there yet, so he has to make do with what is there, which is magic. So I'm just kind of wondering where he'd fit in our society.
Yeah. I think, this is something that I'm glad you brought it up because I'd forgotten, but I wanted to talk about it because I love that aspect of his character where he's always talking about, magic is so crap. Like, you have to put all this effort to do it. Wouldn't it be way better if you could harness lightning to do stuff? Or if if the picture box works by some sort of weird arrangement of gears and levers and
like
lenses.
An Edison type character.
And he's so disappointed when it opens up and it's like a little demon in there painting pictures. And it's like, I thought that was just like a joke. I didn't think it was really what was going on.
Which is another question that we got given, like, did he forget quickly? Because he makes a joke about it being a demon painting pictures, and then it turns out to actually be that, but it's not that he forgot. I think it's that he made a joke and then it turned out to actually be that, which sucks.
Yeah, I think he just didn't assume that was real. Like, because that's the sort of thing that someone would say if he didn't understand how it worked. Like when little kids ask how TV worked and people sometimes go, oh, there's little people
inside. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. It's that kind of explanation. It's a lie to children. It's that thing that Terry Pratchett talks about a lot in the later books. And they forget about it. And the worst place where they forget about it and it doesn't really come back is in the Science of Discworld books, where Rincewind's in all of those. Like they're mostly the last books where he has any kind of significant part. And he's not like, finally, a world that runs on science. I'm so excited. But to get back to your actual question, I don't know, because I don't know if he's cut out for academia at all.
But he is an academic in the little brief section, because he's like Dr. Rincewind.
An expert in what essentially is uncontrolled fires in nuclear reactors is what that translates to. But yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe he would have, like, because he would enjoy from the way he talks about magic. He would much prefer to understand physics and chemistry.
Nikola Tesla or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So whether or not, but I don't know whether he'd actually be a research scientist. I feel like he'd be more like a lecturer.
I don't think he would make breakthroughs or thrive in that way in the field, but I think he'd be very content maybe in a university there, like a lecturer, happily just nerding out over the science,
living in rooms
his
in
perfect
a college.
world. Yep.
I think he'd be one of those lecturers that probably the students would really like, because he'd be really enthusiastic about it,
what he's talking about,
and does the same lectures every year, so he's like nailed it.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that would be good. And obviously in a world, if he was living in our world, he also wouldn't be like nearly being killed by magical disasters every 5 minutes. So
he'd be incredibly happy. Yeah.
Yeah. He'd be quite, he'd
probably be clumsy and accident prone in a different way though.
Yeah. Like maybe he loses his notes a lot.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'd love to see him show up at some point in the Watch series. Probably not in the first season, but in later seasons, bring in characters from the rest of Discworld who live in or hang out in Ankh-Morpork, because obviously the fans want them. And also they'll be able to inject a bit of interest. It's kind of like, you get into later seasons of The Flash, they bring in characters like Elongated Man and like all these weird things.
Have the Rincewind episode.
Yeah, you have a Rincewind episode of The Watch. So I hope that they do that. I think that would be fun. And that they cast him at appropriate age as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that makes sense to me, that he would be sort of a lecturer.
And now the circumfence.
Oh, so good. So they crash into the sea, and they kind of use the luggage as they don't use the luggage as a raft. They use something else as a raft, because the luggage is trying to get to them, but is behind them
through the
at that
dehydrated sea.
And actually, just before we get onto this section, another little thing I'd forgotten is that the picture box has got a tripod, which is also made of sapient pearwood and runs along on its legs. And I'd totally forgotten that. And I thought that was really cute, but they lose it, so it's gone. But hopefully he's still got his pictures. Well, they'll be in the luggage because he was storing them in there.
Because it's not a digital camera. It was like a Polaroid.
Yeah, that's true. Because
the
you
overexposure.
get them instantly.
Yeah.
But now they're lost without the luggage and they're out at sea. And when we rejoin them, and we find out it's been 6 months, not necessarily since the dragon thing, but since they left Ankh-Morpork, they're now sort of cast adrift, having just escaped from a ship full of slavers with the luggage. Actually, they did use the luggage as a raft. That's right. And then they got picked up by a slave ship. They've managed to escape, but the luggage is still on board, like
terrorizing everyone.
It turns into a horror movie.
Who they reminded me of is the pirates in the Asterix books, who always get sunk every time that Asterix and Obelix have to go somewhere else.
Speaking about work safety at the end of each of their disasters. So good.
And there's that guy, the lookout, who's always like, who unfortunately is quite a racist caricature, but apart from that is a great character.
He's amazing,
which is a hard thing to say. But anyway, and he's always like, the goal, it's the goal. And if you can't even get the name of them out, and they get destroyed. And it's always incidental. Like, they never get into a fight with the pirates. It's just Obelix gets on the oars and goes and smashes straight through their ship.
And it's always the same image of them in the sea, hanging over the same pieces of wood at the end every time.
And they're always pissed off with their captain.
Yeah.
It's pirates that came up with insurance, isn't it, as well? Like they were the first users of insurance.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
I saw it in
For Bartholomew Roberts, yes.
I don't know
Welsh
that
pirate.
level of detail, but it was more for like lost limbs. Like if you lost a limb while being a pirate, then you'd get paid a
I
certain
have heard that.
a rudimentary form of
I
it.
never thought of that as being the start of insurance. That's amazing.
But they mentioned pirates when he explains this in Sewer Ants initially, and I was like, is that a nod?
Oh, yeah, because he's like,
Right,
if you're
okay.
taking your cargo somewhere and you get attacked by pirates. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Interesting.
There's all these little things. Happens in every Pratchett book. He's so clever, and he's got all these little references. Very few things are accidental. I mean, sometimes people attribute things to him that he's like, I didn't do that.
Yeah.
Like he actually swears that he was not thinking of Anks or owls when he named Ankh Morpork. He just thought it was a good name. But he later incorporated both of those things into the coat of arms.
Yeah.
But when he came up with it, no, he just liked the name.
like a
Just made it
backronym.
up. Yeah, exactly. And Rincewind, it turns out, is a name from an old newspaper column that he used to read when he was 13 that was kind of like satire of London society and judges and things. And he had this cast of characters who were piss takes of various like important judicial figures. And one of them was called such and such Rincewind. And he never realized that was where it's from until someone pointed it out. And he went back through and looked it up and went, oh, I guess that is where I got it from. Oh, well. He's like, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're adrift for a while on this leaky boat of sorts. And they're very quickly realizing that they are a little bit too close to the edge of the Discworld.
Just a little.
Two Flower's not worried though. He's like, oh, that's exciting.
That's great. Yeah.
Can we do anything about it? No. Well, why worry?
I do like that, because we've skipped over the fact that there's one footnote in this book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just one, which goes to great lengths to explain how the seasons work on the Discworld.
Yes.
But one thing that's never explained is where does all the water come from and where does it go? Because the
From the elephants.
rimfall, it does go right off the edge of the disc into space and is just presumably gone.
Maybe it's like a magic thing that catches it and it just goes back
It's
up
like a
the
magic
middle.
shell that keeps the air in.
Yeah, like it
and
falls
the water
onto
sort
like
of
a magic
goes-
plate almost, and then so like it's pumped back up to the middle.
See, I kind of imagine that scene with the elephants as taking the water with their trunk and just putting it straight back on the world. That was my...
Which means that if you live near the rim, every now and then this giant trunk
a
just
giant
comes
trunk.
up and is like...
This is my only job.
I mean, the sea's pretty weird as it is. Like that surely wouldn't
It
be
would
the
just
weirdest
fit.
thing.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah.
I like that.
They never, you know what, interestingly, I don't think they ever quite describe, I said I don't think Terry ever quite describes how big the elephants are. Like, because they're variously depicted as being quite small, as in that they sort of form a central pillar in the middle of the disc. And then in other illustrations, they kind of go, like their heads are near the actual
Edge.
rim. And
But
I don't
that
think he
doesn't
ever
make-
establishes how big they are.
Like, what's the disc resting on? Is it their heads? Has to be.
It's on their shoulders, I think.
How?
and their
How do
backs.
elephants work? Are they like
Because that's
one
how it
level?
revolves. Is they sort of, I think they move on their shoulders, and that's why the disc revolves. I think that's described in one of the books somewhere.
Does it mean the top peak of the head is the same height as shoulders, or lower?
It's kind of
Maybe.
sloped, though.
'Cause I thought elephants had heads higher than their bodies.
Oh, did they?
I don't know how that works. But they must be bowing their heads because their heads don't stick out from the edge of the disc either.
Or you could take like turns. Like maybe like three of them are holding up the world, and one takes a break, and then they rotate.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it gets down on its knees or something.
Or maybe
Yeah.
the shrug is the signal to change watch.
Yeah.
Because they
Your turn
must
now.
have a really boring life, those elephants. Because they don't get to go anywhere. Like, at least Chewin is swimming through space going somewhere, but the elephants are just always standing in the same spot.
And
They
they don't
get a
get to look-
constant suntan, though, or startan.
And they don't get to look at each other.
No, they can't even talk to each other very well. Oh, I guess they probably have work banter.
Well,
the
our
trunks
butts are
could talk
touching
to
again.
each other.
How's the weight, Barry? It's not.
Well, the
weight,
trunks
Barry.
could talk to each other,
True.
technically.
Yeah, they could aim in different
Yeah, they could
directions.
aim backwards.
Oh, I guess that's true. That's true.
And it
They could
depends on
play-
their perception of time, because it could be very brief to them.
They could be playing games, maybe. Into
I Spy.
Cosmic I Spy. That's
Yeah.
where I was going to. Because they're essentially on the universe's longest car trip.
It's bright and glinting.
Starts with A. Is it a chewin? Yes.
Yes. I see something that begins with D. Disc. Yeah, that's all they could see. Water, disc, stars.
T.
Well,
Trunk.
Well, we also know, I mean, we're about to get to the part, because this is really the only time where Pratchett describes other worlds in the Discworld universe is in these first two books. Because he's not, it's sort of the other planes of existence and other sort of cosmic realms. Yes, they come into some of the other books, but this is the only time he sort of describes other physical places that are separate to the Discworld.
Yeah, because Waterbag comes from one, doesn't he?
Yeah, Tethys.
Yeah, Tethys.
Sorry, yeah, it's much nicer than Waterbag.
Waterbag.
I said that really offended. I was like, wow.
How dare you call him water?
It's like
My favorite character.
It's like when Bender calls us like flesh bags
Yeah.
or whatever.
Let's be fair. He's not a water bag because like surface tension is holding him together.
He doesn't
There's
spill
no bag.
either.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's like how in the lungs, like it's the fluid there has surface tension that keeps it together. So I assume he's just like lung water.
You've thought about this a bit too much.
Yes.
I mean, look, and they haven't even met him yet in the narrative where we're up to, but
Yeah.
that's
True.
they're going to get caught in the circumfence, which is such a good name. Oh,
Yeah.
it's so good. Like
It's fantastic.
It is a pun, but also it's just a really smart name for what it is.
Yeah, it's
Just
my
accurate.
favorite. It's my favorite pun of the book for sure.
Yeah, it's very good. And they just
Edgy.
Because so they think they're going to go over the edge of the world, and they get caught in the circumfence, which is this sort of weird sort of net thing at the edge. And then they kind of black out, don't they? Or do they get rest? No, that's right. Tethys comes along on his little raft and pulls them onto it, and then pulls it because the raft is on these weird little wheels that click into the rope.
And Rincewind passed out, hasn't he? Because he wakes up and they're on the... Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
He doesn't want to look around at the water troll, is what he's been told.
Oh, yeah.
And the
'cause
troll
he's-
is very Eeyore. He
Yeah.
comes across very Eeyore.
Well, he fell off his own planet and landed on a Discworld. Like,
if
I
that
think,
doesn't turn someone into Eeyore.
And every time he finds friends, he has to hand them over to the slavers.
Yeah.
and he is basically a slave. He just gets to keep his tongue because presumably they can't cut off his tongue because it's made of water. He just makes a new one out of the water. I don't know how that would work.
And there's
but-
the Eeyore thing where they try to swipe him with a sword and then realize they're going to get collected, and he's like, "That didn't hurt me, but that hurt me."
Yeah. Yes.
and it doesn't hurt because he's so short because he's got a chronic taste of tides.
The tides.
Oh,
Is he supposed to be Scottish because he has like that pseudo whiskey drink as well that he gives them water, but it's
Yeah.
got like a
Oh,
whiskey
yeah.
name?
yeah, it's like some pun on Glenlivet, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know where he's. I couldn't discern that from him. Just sort of grumpy old English dude.
Is there some Scottish mythos of like a water creature? I
Oh
wonder.
yeah. Well, there's the water horse, which is called not Selkie.
Kelpie?
Kelpie. Yeah, Kelpie. Yeah, but they're not like that
No.
intelligent. I don't think. I mean, there's like bog hags and
Yeah.
lake witches and stuff like
Bog hags. And you thought water bag was bad.
that. No, but like that's what they're called.
That's actually what they're called.
Oh, it's still pretty mean though.
It's
I
pretty
mean, no
bad.
wonder they were pissed off the whole time.
Yeah. They're like, well.
Bog hags, that's what you're calling us. Yeah, well, I will drink your blood and steal your children, you jerks.
I'll show you, bog hag.
Because, those are the sort of legends that you have when, there's some very deep lakes and very cold
true,
times
yeah.
and not very good visibility because of all the mist. And
Mist.
you're going to just vanish
And the
into the
moors.
sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
The swamp.
makes sense. But yeah, I love Tethys. What a great character. And Tethys is a character from Greek mythology. It might be Roman the name, but it's one of the moons of Saturn, I think, is named Tethys. But it was like a water nymph, I think,
Right.
rather than a dude. But similar kind of lived in the sea,
Yeah.
associated with water.
And they mention his planet, all blue, all sea.
Bathys.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was like one of the sailors who'd go out into the dry parts to find stuff. I thought that was great.
Is their world literally like all sea though? Like, wouldn't that be like us living in a world of flesh?
Yeah, well, more. I think
Like, we live in like a world of hydrogen and oxygen, and also like it's made of
Yeah.
the stuff we're made of. So I guess it's just
Yeah, I guess it's like we live on the solid parts of our land, not in the liquid parts.
liquid,
and he lived
yeah.
in the liquid parts of his world, not on the solid parts.
But he does say it's all blue.
Yeah. So who knows?
Who knows?
But then again, it's like rock trolls live on mountains.
Yes.
So it's kind of like that, I guess.
Yep.
I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, the circumfence. What a great,
yeah.
Yeah.
so good. And the whole again, he's very in this book. Later, he does like to figure out how things work, but he's more interested in how the culture and the society of these things work, and then the technology is important when it's important to the
when it's
plot.
important,
Whereas in this book, I think he feels like he's having fun exploring the mechanics of the world,
Yeah.
which I enjoyed as well. I thought that was a lot of fun, and the way that he describes how the circumfence works and Kroll's sort of sticking out over the edge, and then when they come to collect them, the Krollians. and they're coming on the big glass lens that's like it's more like a watch lens like you'd use in chemistry rather than like a Fresnel lens, although they do say the spell that creates it is named after Fresnel, which I thought was great. And another Dungeons and Dragons spell name. But how that works, like the mechanics of the hydrophobes who are trained not just to fear, but to like loathe water and reject it with their loathing.
There's a lot of description in the vehicles as well, like in how the ship is, and even Tethys' vehicle, like that's super well described. The cables connecting, seeing where the ropes are going. So I think we get to this point in the book, and then it really kicks up into the science part of the story. I think like this final chapter feels very much leaving the world of sword and sorcery behind, moving into something else.
Yeah.
Waterworld, no.
Oh, no. Not that.
No one's got gills.
No.
Paper. Paper.
No.
Oh.
I'm so sorry.
I thought we were going to avoid that, right?
I mean, it's about to turn into like, Apollo 13 as well. So I don't know whether, but it's, the Krullians, because they've got that sort of very kind of fantasy technological society, but also they have loads of magic, just heaps of magic, including like this 13. Now, when they're being fetched on the lens and there's all the hydrophobes strapped to it who are propelling it above the waves, the person who's come to collect them I thought it was a really weird sort of specific character, because she's a 13 or 14-year-old girl who, like, when she takes her cowl off and she speaks to them in a language they can understand, and she's got like this like rod of nullification, and she's been briefed on who they are, and she's got a name, and I'm like, is she going to be important? Because I don't remember her, and there's a lot of there's a lot of detail that's got into this character, and then. But it's like weird detail. Like Pratchett's, like his incidental characters are always really interestingly well drawn. They're never like super two-dimensional. Like they've always got like at least a few interesting personality traits to hang on. But she feels like she's sort of set up to be something else. Like we don't really find out who she is as a person.
In one of the most recent X-Men, Anna Paquin is billed very highly, even though she's in like 10 seconds of it. It's because she had a whole arc about being rescued from the school that got cut out because it made the movie drag. And I kind of feel like maybe there was an edit that she was more significant. But
now I'm just going to imagine her as a young Anna Paquin.
Like so with an Oscar?
From the first, and for the first X-Men movie, instead of from Days of Future Past, is the one you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because there is you can get the edit that's got her storyline in it. Like they've done a director's cut style.
I don't want to watch it because it's boring enough to cut. So that's what I think would happen with Marchesa.
But what they do have up their sleeve is they're sort of waiting to be executed as sacrifices. Is while they were on the boat, nearly going over the rim, Rincewind spotted a frog as one of the things that was getting swept over, and he used an oar to rescue it. And Two Flowers sort of gives him a look, and he goes, "Oh, and it, you know what? As a character moment, it felt so it fitted this version of Rincewind so well. Like I don't know that I would imagine the modern Rincewind doing that. Like
Probably
I think
swear at it a little.
He'd be too freaking out. He'd be too complaining,
losing it,
and depressed, and just be like, "I'm gonna die," and you're like, "Oh, come on, dude!" But he rescues the frog, and then it turns out that the frog, was like but was hitchhiking on the frog is the lady who appears to them and says, "I will give you one moment," because Fate is really pissed that the lady won her game against him earlier in the book by using Rincewind and Two Flower as her pieces, and so now he wants them dead. And in order for him to give his blessing to the craft that the Krullians are about to send over the edge to try and figure out whether Atuan is a male or female, which is basically a fool's errand because you cannot tell by looking with a turtle. Like it's it's not external.
Small turtles on the disc?
There are.
Okay.
But you'd have to dissect. We wouldn't have to dissect them, but you'd have to like grab them and like examine them very closely. And apparently, mostly in zoology, you sex turtles by comparing them because they have a few things that are different, but you
Not
have
just
to
like
have
playing
multiple.
them Barry White and like dimming the lights.
No, I don't think
You have to
do
wait
that.
for the Big Bang, and then they should send the craft over.
No.
So how does one sex a turtle?
You compare the males and females because you know that the males are generally smaller, but they have thicker tails.
Oh, so you just get
Apparently.
get another giant turtle.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
wait
but
for
they
the-
don't.
yeah.
They don't have another one, so they're not going to be able to compare anything when they go over the edge. So this was the advice that I was reading about this, and like this is what a zoologist said. That's like they're not going to be able to do it. Like they won't know.
Couldn't they just measure him though? Like they could use like physics to measure it so that when they have something to compare it to.
You could do that without having to go down there, though. Surely, you could work that out if you could observe it because they already dangle things off the edge,
And they
just to
can
look
see the tail.
in Kroll. They mentioned that
Yeah.
at the start, but this is the first time they're sort of launching something out into space.
So what are they planning to actually do you think?
It's not very clear how it works because they never really explain it to Farron Rincewind. Like you know that they're going to launch this craft and it's going to go into space so it can see the turtle, but you're not clear exactly how it's supposed to get back
What they're going to achieve, yeah.
or what exactly they're going to do measurements wise.
Why did we go to the moon? What did it really achieve other than we could and sort of helping with the Cold War effort?
Well, it was, it achieved a lot of things, but less so. The arrival on the moon didn't achieve that much, but all the technological
race to it,
advancements
yeah.
required to get there,
The race
did
to it,
loads of stuff. And, it's also useful to have landed on the moon and be able to observe things and say, okay, well, now we know the moon is like a real pain in the ass place if we wanted to live here.
So it could be kind of like that, like it could be their arbitrary reason is they want to see what
To develop
gender
the technology to
a
get that.
human is, but it could be like that's just the reason to make them do a thing, and there could be some political intrigue above.
They seem
just
quite
that we don't know.
earnest about it, though.
Yeah, but I guess the scientists would be.
That's true, because they don't show the people be above the scientists.
Yeah.
And we also glossed over the bit where the person who designed it was the gold eyes, golden eyes
Dactylos.
Yes.
Dactylos, who was just a master builder who kept getting bits cut off him every time he did good stuff.
And then
Yeah.
eventually killed. Yeah, which happened to plenty of real world designers. Yeah, that's
The classic Taj Mahal-ism.
Did that
that a
happen
thing?
to
Yeah.
the Taj Mahal
Yeah.
person?
The architect, yeah.
Oh wow.
Wasn't the plan
He
for them
put
to
out
go
his
to
eyes because he didn't want him to make another one like it.
Apparently, the similar story in Russia.
Russia, yeah.
Yeah.
I had this book where it was just a list of horrible things that happened to architects.
I would
to be a
read the
career
heck out of that.
decision. Yeah, to be like, this sounds like a great
They
idea.
never tell you that in careers class, do they?
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of, in a way, reminds me of J.K. Rowling, because one of the things that when Harry Potter was getting popular, there were a lot of people who were like, "Well, this isn't very good stuff for kids." I'm like, "Are you serious? Like, do you know how many kids are like Googling mythology now because she's like used a basilisk in her story and people are like, what the hell is a basilisk?" And before the top hit for it was like the Harry Potter wiki, you would look it up on Wikipedia and we go, well, a basilisk is a creature from folklore in these countries and these mythologies and this is what it means and these are the different ways in which it's been depicted. And then in after all that, there's like in popular culture. And you're like, well, this is cool, and that it's exposing people to lots of stuff that they wouldn't otherwise be interested in.
Oh, yeah. Or people learning about ancient Rome by reading Asterix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I learned about ancient Rome. That's how I know that there's such a thing as Gaul,
Yeah.
And also how you can get questions horrifically wrong in science class if you're going off the Universe song by Monty Python.
It's a bit out of date now. There is a more recent version of it. Like Eric Idle wrote an up-to-date version of it for I can't remember what it was. It was some science thing. Anyway, let's not talk about it.
But we're back in the room where Lady Luck has helped them out. And
Lady who?
you can't say her name.
The
Well,
lady,
actually,
the lady. And I like that her like moment that she gives them is that earlier on, Rincewind throws this bottle of wine because they're
Yes, and
they're
it's
giving them this
suspended.
lavish lifestyle for the like one day they have before they're sacrificed.
Like the Hunger Games,
Or that episode of Sliders.
which I still haven't watched yet.
Oh, it's good. The last episode of the first season. The first season's great. The last episode of the first season is a killer episode, and it ends on a real cliffhanger, which they don't worry too much about how it's resolved because it's not resolved great. But it's such a good episode, and it's got a similar thing where there's someone who's given a lavish lifestyle because they don't have long to live. But yeah, he throws this bottle of wine at the attendant who casts a spell to slow it down.
And there's a good amount of jealousy. Yeah.
And then the magic winds down just as they come back to collect them and it pings him in the head. And so they I think Rincewind knees somebody in the groin while they're surprised and they run off. And he's actually quite like spry and active, Rincewind, in this book. Like right at the start when he's like in the barroom brawl and someone's about to throw a dagger at him, he like throws up his hands and pretends to cast a spell, and the other guy flinches.
And he keeps talking as he walks down
kick him. It's great. I love it.
I actually have a note. I remembered at this point exactly as you said. Where I thought, wow, he hits a lot of people. Like Rincewind does punch a good number of people and knees a lot of people in the groin.
He's like a weasel.
Yeah.
No, there's already a weasel in the book.
Oh yeah, sure. But he is like a rodent. So
like they said, like the rat that
a mouser, one might say.
But they get out of there. They end up like they run through the city looking for somewhere to hide. They go into a special chamber. And in the special chamber, there's these two white leather suits hanging up from hooks. And Rincewind, again, with his genre awareness, is just like, I knew you were going to tell us that we should get into those.
These. Yeah.
And eventually they do when the two Krullian Chelonauts come in and talk to them in a language that they don't understand. And they almost speak back before Rincewind like stops Two Flower because it's like, no, remember they cut all the tongues out of the slaves. I thought that was really clever. It's just a nice little detail where that's Rincewind thinking on his feet and being smart about things. And even in later books, actually, I think Rincewind... he is quite cluey and smart. It's just that he becomes so jaded and cynical that it overrides that and you don't notice so much because he complains about having to be the one who sorts this stuff out.
Yeah, and there's a good balance, I think, in this one where he does complain a lot, but he also solves problems. Like he sort of stumbles his way to victory for the majority of the book.
And then we get this great final sequence where they... disguise themselves in the Chelonauts suits, having knocked out the two people who are supposed to be wearing them.
Which one's waddling?
Well, I assumed that would be Rincewind because he's got his robes on underneath. But it might also be Two Flower because he's smaller and it doesn't fit him as well. I thought
Two Flower just for the comedic effect.
They do describe the guys who are supposed to wear them as big strapping lads. But yeah, they go out through the crowds who are watching, and there's one of the head astronomers is like, wait a minute. He's totally figured out that it's not them, and he's about to cast a spell to like zap them, but the crowd are all standing up and applauding and kind of in his way. And then this sea monster that had been previously reported as coming on land, and they're like, well, we get sea monsters all the time, just kill it, arrives and that gets zapped by some magic, which destroys the seaweed that's on it, and it's of course the luggage, which has finally turned up following its master. And then there's this magic. I just imagine it like there's this sort of one zap of magic and then a bit of a pause. And I can just see it like in a sort of Spielberg high special effects scene. And then there's like all these bolts of like different magical spells going. And this smoke and it's sapient pearwood. It doesn't care. It's unaffected by magic. And they escape by ending up on the vehicle that's meant to go over the edge. With Tethys, the sea troll, who's been inside the luggage all this time, got swallowed by it.
Living at the edge.
Yeah.
He's got this great thing where he talks about things, and then when he gets to the end of his little monologue and he says, here on the edge. And it's always in italics. Yeah. And I was like, is that a reference to something?
Yeah, I was trying to figure that out.
But I just really liked it. It's like his
And Rincewind
mantra.
goes, can you stop saying that at one point? Here on the edge.
Yeah, it's like his grisly catchphrase.
It's like time's a flat circle.
Yeah. That's your one.
There we go.
Guy on that bridge.
Times two.
And they eventually go over the edge. And I like that Two Flower by the stage once he's realized what the vehicle is for, and after hearing Tethys' stories of these other worlds, because Tethys describes them, and there's like this one that's like Norse mythology because it's like a serpent coiled around a world
dragon,
and there's all ice, and then there's like another one and another one, and Two Flower's like, I want to see this stuff, this sounds amazing, and Rincewind is like, you are crazy, this is a bad idea, but Two Flower's like, I'm going in, and he gets in. And I'd totally forgotten that like Rincewind doesn't go in with them. He's sort of like hanging on to the outside. And then there's that little bit at the end.
Literal cliffhanger.
Where he's, hanging off the edge of the cliff. And it seems like death is there. And because
Lady Luck's helped him out probably by catching him on a tree as he goes over the edge.
And Death's like, haha.
And we haven't mentioned Death because he shows up quite a bit earlier.
We need to because...
There's a lot to say about him.
He is not the same. He's not... Well, there's the glimpses of the character that he becomes. And I think out of all the things in the book, it's Rincewind and Death that are the most different from whatever else happens. Like even the patrician who maybe
He's not veterinary.
He's
he's got veterinary vibes, but he's not.
It's an interesting distinction because that was the fan theory for a long time, but Pratchett's like, no, it's the same guy, but everyone was still going, no, we don't think it is. And so he was like, sort of gave up, and he was like, all right, it's the same guy written by a worse author. And everyone's like, that's okay. We don't like that explanation, but all right.
But fine. Yeah.
It could be him if you imagine it. Like, it could be the same person.
And I also thought he was going to show up in Krull because I had the whole, like, he liked jellifish and candied starfish, and then they were being fed that stuff. I'm like, ooh, is veterinary going to show up? And then I was like, wait, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
No, it's just fancy food everywhere is like gross jellyfish stuff apparently. But yeah, death is very different in this book. I mean, there's a fan theory that it's not the same death.
But it has to be.
That somebody else is filling in for him during the events of this story, like he's having a little holiday.
He is the kind of death, and I'm sorry, Joel, because you haven't read this one, but he is the kind of death I think that Mort would have been if he, like, because they imply that Mort would have gone real dark, but I think if Mort was just like doing the humdrum death, and it was just his personality, he's just a bit grumpy and just a bit hard done by, and I think that's the kind of death this would have been.
Just having a bad day.
Yeah.
Bad life.
Because he says sod you then, like at one point, and like the death we all know and love does not talk like that.
No, he's much kinder. And there's also that thing where early in the book, as he keeps turning up to claim Rincewind when Rincewind isn't going to die.
Yeah.
And you're like, that's not how death works. Like, he knows when someone's going to die.
Yeah.
And he scares a cat like a ninth to death.
Yeah, that is that really is at odds with the death that we know, who loves cats and kittens and would never hurt them. And I think that there's that fan theory that this is not the usual death. Death is like having a bit of a holiday, and this is somebody filling in for him. To which I think is based on like an aside in one of the books that may or may not indicate that has happened. And then by the end, but all early on, as Rincewind sort of escapes his clutches, and Two Flower as well, where he seems determined to kill him, he's like, no, this is my hobby now. I'm gonna get your souls. And it's like, he's not collecting souls. He's like just arriving to make sure that people's souls leave when they die.
Send them on their way.
Because they've got the saddlebags thing where they imply it's full of souls because they don't weigh anything.
Yeah, I like that where he talks about how the horse, the rider doesn't weigh that much, and the saddlebags
and he treats the horse kinder than most men.
Yeah. He doesn't get named in this book, but in Mort we find out his horse is called Binky, and it's but he's also quite like, he's described quite differently, the horse in this book, because he's got like nostrils of flame and
red eyes,
whereas Binky's just a normal but very lovely and slightly super powerful white horse. But yeah, death, he's going to get them, and then later on he's like, nah, giving it up. When Fate turns up and he's sharpening his scythe, and Fate's like, you will get these guys. And he's like, yeah, I was going to, but that's fine. Get everyone in the end. It doesn't matter. I don't need to chase them. And you're like, wow, for an immortal entity, that's quite a rapid period of change there over the course of less than 6 months.
I do like the description of the two characters that mentioned the grain is Rincewind, I believe, and then Fate, and Death has to repeat it twice that I just can't help it. This is just how I am.
Yeah, because I'm a skull.
Yeah, I'm a skull.
Yeah, I thought that was cute. But yeah, he's very different. And then at the end of the book, he's not even there, because he tells Fate, like, oh, I'm kind of busy today.
Yeah.
Like, there's a plague. I've got to walk
You got to show up
streets.
for wizards, though. Like, it's like the thing.
That's the deal.
Yeah.
And this is the only time... Oh, well, he does send Mort, but then it's
That's for a reason.
But then it's like Death has come in person. It's just that Death is being...
He's handed over the baton.
The part of Death is being played by Mort today. So when there's a witch and a wizard and a few other people who need to be collected in person. So it's a bit different and a bit weird. And his personality is certainly not the Death that we know. And I think it's just one of those things where, again, Pratchett knew what he wanted to do, which was play with that character of Death, go with that Grim Reaper idea, but then make him a bit funny and a bit different. But then he's decided that actually, once he gets to Mort, he's like, no, I want to go in a different direction with how Death works.
I'm glad he did. Like, I'm glad he didn't just sort of stick to his guns, being like, oh, well, I've written him like this, so I have to do it.
Yeah.
And he's very free with that. Like, there's lots of, I mean, like with anything that lasts for a long time, like there's lots of little continuity things and stuff where he always changes his mind to write what he thinks would be best at the time. And he doesn't worry too much about those continuity things. Like, he'll often put little nods to things that have happened, but he doesn't really worry about it. And I think that's the best way to do it. And particularly when you're writing a series of novels and you're trying to make each one fairly standalone, it's not like one ongoing storyline. I think that's the best decision, and
Yeah.
and I think that this is where you notice it the most, the changes he's made from the really early stuff.
So Pratchett, I don't think went back very much and changed and did revisions to his books. Did he?
No.
Yeah.
But he himself was quite down on the first couple of books. Like, he's in interviews, he's one of the first people to say, I don't think you should start with those. Like, that's when someone's still learning to write. And again, I dispute that. I don't think so. I think they're very well written, but just very much written with a different goal and a different style in mind.
I think that's the thing I sensed, and only from hearing other people's discussion on the books, the books following it. I don't think they're bad books. I just don't think that's what he eventually ended up writing or wanting to write. Basically repeating what you said. But yeah, I can, and maybe he did learn how to write specific characters in a way that he wanted. Maybe not nailing them down quite so much, like you mentioned, Death. But yeah, maybe also changing Rincewind to a character that you didn't enjoy very much, Liz.
Yeah, so Death got better and Rincewind got worse.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Although, again, I'm very much looking forward to revisiting those later Rincewind books to see if I still feel that.
But by worse, I mean, like, I still feel like he followed the arc that was set up in these books.
Yeah.
So, like, as in, like,
The
it's what would have
eventual
happened
Frodo.
to the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
He's been pointed in that direction. And in fact, particularly what happens in the Light Fantastic. Like, I think there's, like, because that's like an apocalyptic storyline, like much more so than this book, and this is another thing that reminded me of Douglas Adams when I was reading it, is it's like a collection of stuff that happens for comedic effect rather than really one cohesive ongoing story.
Yeah.
Because he just sort of sends them to different places where he thinks this will be a fun story that I want to tell.
Yeah.
This is a style of book that I want to parody. And that's very much what Adams does in the Hitchhikers.
Like a pastiche of really great stuff.
Yeah, particularly in the early Hitchhikers books. You know, it's like, I want to do a thing about bureaucracy. So they get, they hitch a ride with these bureaucratic aliens. And now I want to do a thing about how ridiculous opulence is. So let's tell a story about a planet that made other planets. And let's go to a restaurant at the end of the universe. But it's all serving the gag rather than the gag serving a story. And I think there's an element to that in this.
I'd argue that this is kind of like a rudimentary version of Witches Abroad, though. Like, it is, it's the tourism story, it's the series of misadventures in mysterious lands. It's just, there's more of a plot in Witches Abroad.
Yeah.
But it's very similar. Like, if you got to the skeleton of it, I think they'd be quite similar.
Yeah, that's I'd agree with that. But absolutely, there's more of a plot in Witches Abroad. I mean, the travelogue part, like we discussed in the Witches Abroad episode, feels very much like a bit of an aside to the plot, and then you kind of get back to the plot. And as you get closer to the main plot part of the book, it starts to sort of hook back into it. Yeah.
But now, Scrofula.
Oh, yeah, because it's not Death
Yes.
waiting for Rincewind on the rim, is it?
Yeah, it's Scrofula, like a weird spin-off of TB, which I don't understand why it's called a demon, first of all, why it's its own thing. Like, famine and pestilence are things that sometimes fill in, but why is Scrofula, like, got its own, like...
Well, I think it's just the demon's name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe all demons are named after particularly.
But he's
Doesn't he
also-
say no one
diseases.
dies of Scrofula, though? Like, isn't that something he says?
Yeah, he
Yeah,
does
no
say
one
that.
dies of Scrofula. I've got rights. I'm a wizard.
But he also, I mean, Scrofula himself has a very Mort-esque moment because he sort of goes, I'm making rather a mess of this, aren't I? And it's more like he's just doing a mate a favour. Although why Death is a mate with demons
yeah.
is anybody's guess. I
Is
mean,
there a hierarchy going on here?
well, he hasn't really established a sort of cosmology of
Yeah.
how this stuff works. And even in the later books, he doesn't really go into that much detail. There's one book that goes to hell and has demons in a major way, which is Eric. And that's pretty much it.
I mean, Scrofula, I think, if the Discworld is like our world, it's really not around that much, so he's probably just got some time. So he just fills in as like the substitute guy, or he's like a temp, so he's just
He's trying to rise the corporate ladder. He's trying to get up there.
He's an agency, that's why he's worried about like messing it up. He's like, oh, it's like the first job I've been offered in like a couple of months. I really need to make a good impression.
Maybe he wants to
million
get to be a
years.
disease that actually kills people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. Oh, Scrofula. Anyway,
nasty.
Scrofula doesn't take him either because Rincewind falls off the edge, which is the end of the book.
Bit of a cliffhanger, one might say.
Well, yeah.
not.
Although I
absolutely.
don't know if this is still the same in your edition, but mine has two bits where it says the end.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mine has
so-
that too.
Yeah, because there's the bit where the the ship goes over the edge and the luggage follows it, and then it says the end. Then Rincewind wakes up because he's no longer attached to the ship. He was sitting on top of it, and now he's hanging on to the edge. And he can see the ship far below him. Yeah, I actually don't remember how that's resolved. It'd be interesting when we get around to reading The Light Fantastic, which we will eventually. Eventually. We'll come back to that. I've got more to say about that. But I think that brings us to the end of the book. I mean, are there any favourite bits, any sort of general observations we want to make that we haven't covered? I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground already. Yeah. I do want to say again that I really enjoyed this, and I kind of thought I would like it, but I liked because I've always been a bit fond of it. But I thought, how much of that is nostalgia because it was my first one, and I read it when I was very young. But actually, I really dug it a lot for all its differences from the sort of the rest of Pratchett. I just really liked it.
I think it was a good recommendation for me as well. I think particularly to my tastes. For me, it was a greatest hits of Sword and Sorcery, at least for the majority of the way through. And then the last bit was a different genre almost for me.
Yeah.
And it was in the way of a satire that didn't deal with the source material. It didn't insult it in one sense. It's a loving homage. And it certainly does, poke fun, but in a respectful way. And that's the kind of satire that I like. I think a lot of the time, modern authors, when they go back and they do anything, specifically with Sword and Sorcery, because it's a very easy genre to like be like, oh, you. But I think he does it in a way that's, is really good. So, yeah.
So I've been dreading reading this one the whole time we've been doing the podcast, and I was pleasantly surprised to enjoy reading it. And so I'm less dreading the... I mean, I did have the thing where I opened it up to that giant footnote and I went, oh... And I put it away for a week and then I came back. Because I did find that footnote exceptionally tedious. I mean, it set up a lot of important stuff, but it was really grueling to get through. It's like trying to read like a really tough part of a textbook and you're like, I need to understand this. It's really important. And I want to know it, but it was just really...
It says a lot of stuff not connected to the rest of the story.
Well, and really early on,
like footnote,
but early on, so you haven't sort of like built enough affection for the narrative to allow for like an intrusion such as this.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, I loved it, and I remember loving it back then because I was like fascinated with the idea of how would this world work, and I think that it's interesting that Pratchett goes out of his way to explain it when, say, George R.R. Martin has never explained what the deal is with the seasons in the world of Westeros.
But he also doesn't understand the distance between places either. So
he doesn't, but he swears he is on record as saying there is there's a narrative reason for it, and it will be explained in the last book, but I'm not telling you what it is now. And you're like,
you're just going to make something
made it up yet? Have
it's
you?
A bit of a shrug response,
But I think I did really like. Was very like arrogant, but it's the quote. It's in my book, page 23. So the fire and its subsequent flood, which destroyed everything left that was not flammable and added a particularly noisome flux to the survivors' problems, did not mark its end. So I very much enjoyed my cameo.
Is it related to the river at all?
Yes,
no,
sort of.
Sort of. Yeah, so that's a good one for you.
Yeah, particularly noisome.
No, nice. That's nice. I enjoyed the fact that when we made Moving Pictures, I was amazed that the phrase "it's not a thing" was in there, and I was sure that it predated its use in popular culture elsewhere. And similarly, in this book, in the second section or towards the end of the first one, it's in the second section when Two Flower is in the temple, and the demon in the picture box is very nervous. There's this bit. I don't like it, said the picture imp from his box around Two Flower's neck. Why not? Inquired Two Flower. It's weird. But you're a demon. Demons can't call things weird. I mean, what's weird to a demon? Oh, said the demon cautiously, glancing around nervously and shifting from claw to claw. Things. Stuff. Things, stuff. This book's from 1983. Yeah. Like, that's got to predate it certainly from the internet meme era. Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Oh, I really enjoyed when the Dryad is sort of being like, you're not a proper wizard, and the conversation they have. She's like, I should have realized that you weren't a real wizard when I saw you didn't have a staff. Lost it in a fire, lied Rincewind automatically. No hat with magic sigils embroidered on it. We blew off. No familiar. It died. Look, thanks for rescuing me.
He's got an excuse for everything. I do like that that's a consistent part of his character. He's like, I am a wizard. I don't have such a narrow idea of what a wizard is.
Look, it died, all right?
Right up until the point that he doesn't as well, where he says, I'm not that much of a wizard.
It's interesting because we never meet that. I mean, until we get the faculty of Unseen University, we never meet that many wizards. But all the ones we meet up until we have the faculty
are a bit of frauds.
Though they're all a bit useless because there's Rincewind, there's Cutwell in Mort, who can do magic but just isn't very good at it. He's better at understanding magic than casting spells. And then there's Vincent in Victor Tugelbend in Moving Pictures, who is really not. He's only there because he's on a scholarship, and he understands magic very, very well, but he doesn't do any because he's like, I don't really want to be a wizard. I'm just here for the sweet life of being a perpetual student. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
The Krull wizards seem like they're a bit more competent, but like it seems like their magic is different.
Yeah, like
it's more science magic.
Yeah, well, the spells that they cast seem to follow some of the same rules, but then again, this book is full of rules of magic that then Pratchett's like, oh, they get in the way of the story. Forget them,
and shrugs, moves on.
Like he had fun with them in this book, and then he's like, I don't need them anymore. Forget it. And I think. That was a good call.
There's a particular line of description I think really caught me. It was that first thing. So this is one of the few lines where I could see a direct correlation to something that I'd read in the past, but such a good twist and humorous twist. So it was a description of her own. The wide chest, the neck like a tree trunk, the surprisingly small head under its wild thatch of black hair, looking like a tomato on a coffin. He could put a name to the creeping figure, and that name was Sharon the Barbarian. It was so good.
Yeah, that was
fantastic.
There's one other bit I want to read. I just really enjoyed this gag from near the end of the book when they've been captured and it's being explained to them that they're going to be sacrificed. What do you want to sacrifice us for? Asked Two Flower. You hardly know us. And that's rather the point, isn't it? It's not very good manners to sacrifice a friend. That makes absolute sense. Yeah. I'm like,
but it's also not a sacrifice.
Yeah, true. That is true. I like where you went with that. It might be time for some questions from the listeners, Liz.
And we've covered a bit of it, either when we've flagged it specifically or we've covered it in the conversation in general. I'm going to shorten this question from Des, which is, what characters or places would you like to have seen again? Like, there's characters who were mentioned in this that we didn't see ever again.
Look, I was really quite fond of Tethys. I think if he'd come back, I mean, he does come back. He's in like Fantastic, the direct sequel to this book, but I don't remember how much of it he's in, and I would have liked to see him again. Yeah. And Two Flower more often. Like we do see him again, but not until Interesting Times, and then that's kind of the only other time we see him. And I really liked him as a character.
And coming off that question, there's one from Ilbion, which is, what book or region that we don't know would you like to see Two Flower visiting again?
Oh, as in like he's being a tourist on the disc and he goes to Ankh-Morpork and then a couple of other places, but
send him to Australia.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Two Flower in 4X. The lost there's a book on the last continent, and there's another continent on the disc that nobody really has explored, and it is a complete piss take of Australia, and the continent's called XXXX because nobody knows what it's called. Yeah. That's just how it's marked on the maps. Yeah.
Here's a good one that I think maybe is good for Joel. It's from it's QIXEDE. So while this was my first Discworld book and pulled me in, is it really the best book to start with? So I feel like Ben's and my opinion on this is already quite established because we discussed that with how we chose to start the podcast. But this was your first one.
It's incredibly competent as like a fun read. So I think if you go in with no understanding of the Discworld, it's actually a lot of fun. But again, maybe a little bit biased. I have all this, collected protocols from enjoying sword and sorcery and fantasy in general. So maybe that enhanced that. So if you didn't have that, don't know.
Yeah.
But if you enjoy that kind of stuff, then...
Yeah, and I think there's so much Pratchett and there's so many things that have a different angle that there's lots of ways in. I don't think even the two that we suggested and started our podcast with are the only or best entries into the series. Like there's other places you could start. And in fact, we've been working on an article that we want to post on the website about that. And maybe this is a good time to finally post that. Not so much about places to start, but more sort of about how you can approach reading them. Because it is daunting to get into a series of 41 novels. But it's important to remember most of them pretty much stand alone. And there are sub-series within that. So, yeah, I think there's lots of places to start. But this one worked for me and it worked for you, Joel.
Yeah,
and I know
absolutely.
It's worked for some of our listeners because they've mentioned that. Although someone did ask, did anyone continue reading after reading this? Yes, hello, it was me. And hopefully will be Joel as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And some previous guests as well. I think Steph Convery had started at the beginning and made her way through.
Yep.
All right, so here's another one, and I think I know what you both are going to answer. Should I actually read any of the high fantasy this book spoofs?
But Joel, I'll let you take this one first.
Spoilers, yes.
Yeah, I'm way too excited about this question too. I'm like, oh, cool, I get to talk about weird sword and sorcery that no one cares about and probably rightly should not care about. Yes, absolutely. There's some great source material that I think still has a good amount of carryover today. Like Elric is great. Michael Moorcock is one of the authors that transitions very well into the modern era. So maybe not Robert E. Howard and, Wagner, Carl Edward Wagner. But I'd say Moorcock is one of the better ones.
I think
and Fritz Leiber as well,
yeah,
for sure.
Leiber. I keep saying Leiber. It's Leiber, isn't it?
Yeah.
Depends on if you love it or not.
That was good. I like that one.
Like it.
It's our first intra-language pun, I
Yeah.
believe. Very good.
Oh, you should hear my Cantonese puns.
And I would say read one or two of the Lovecraft stories, but
Yep.
if you're interested in that kind of eldritch horror, because he did invent a whole genre
He did.
of cosmic
Yeah.
horror, and it is an interesting genre, but I really think a lot of the stories are not that great, and my favorite ones are the ones he wrote towards the end. My absolute favorite,
Yes.
if you're going to read just one, is The Shadow Out of Time.
Yeah.
But also The Color Out of Space, which is about a weird color that can't be described, but at one point I think also is described as a kind of weird greenish purple.
Yeah.
Is also an interesting one.
Or maybe Octarine.
So I'm just going to acknowledge that George Stevens sent us a good question that we've covered across the course of the thing, which is what do we think the various parts are spoofing? We've also covered Tracy Reddington's question about how death compares. And we've also covered Ashu and Sneeze's question about continuing on from The Color of Magic. And that brings us to the end.
Well, one
wasn't
more
everything, but
question for me this time, and that's to you, Liz.
You got to tweet it in. No.
Is the next recommendation.
Ooh, yeah, that's right.
The pressure's on.
I think that Pratchett recommendations we've talked about are very personal and it depends on the reader themselves, which is why there's so many different entry points. I think since you enjoyed this one, I would probably just go chronological. Like I would just go through it all in order because then you can see how the world unfolds.
Yeah.
Especially since you've already started at the beginning and liked it.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, I will pick that up then.
It worked for
the
me.
light fantastic.
So I think it'll work for you too.
Because they'll pace them all quite nicely as well. So you won't go through like a chunk that you like and then there's like a chunk you don't.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming, Joel.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
It's been great to have you on. And now, of course, people can hear your voice on your own podcast, The Morning Bell. How do people find it?
All right, so it's themorningbell.com.au is the website. You can find us on iTunes. That's probably the best place, easiest place to listen to us. We are pretty much done for the year. So I just recorded the last podcast at the Brunswick Street Bookstore for the year, and that will come out over the period of like the next 2-3 weeks.
And to describe it in a nutshell for the listeners, how would
Absolutely.
you describe the Morning Bell?
So the Morning Bell is basically a conversational style podcast, bringing on authors, publishers, agents, people involved in the writing industry and publishing industry to talk about their experiences and to nut it down, basically. So very conversational. We talk about media, and then we move on to topic sections. So I think, Ben, you were on, and Liz, you were also on.
Yeah, we have both been on. We might even link to our previous episodes of The Morning Bell in our show notes. And to also one of the people behind Speculate, the Melbourne Speculative Fiction Festival, which started earlier this year, which is coming back to Melbourne in 2019 in March.
It is. It's very exciting. So March 15th and 16th are the dates of Speculate, and conversations sort of like the Morning Bell, but very much focused around speculative fiction, bringing names in that you might not see on the Melbourne circuit very much, but also those names that maybe don't get a lot of run time, but have a lot to say and a lot of wisdom. So yeah, absolutely check it out.
Cool. Well, we'll link to Speculate as well, because it's probably a bit early for news of who's going to be on.
A little bit, yeah. The newsletter is probably the best place to follow us. We'll have announcements coming out like end of December, January. So
right.
Newsletter.
That'll also be linked at the top of the show notes. And look, before we get on to talking about what we're going to do next time, you're probably, listeners, wondering when we're going to cover the light fantastic. Well, it seems only fair to wait for that book's 35th anniversary of publication. So we'll find out how Rincewind escapes from his cliffhanger in June 2021. So you thought waiting a week for the next episode of The Good Place was bad. But it's going to be fine.
It's 2 weeks because of Thanksgiving.
It's the worst. I can't believe they don't have a special Thanksgiving episode.
Yeah.
But next time, we're going to do something a little bit not topical, that's not really accurate, but next year in 2019, Amazon Prime is bringing to our television screens the one and only Good Omens. And we thought we'd get in first. And so in January, our episode will be all about the book Good Omens.
You won't even have to watch the TV series if you listen to our episode.
Yeah.
No, you'll know
It'll be
everything that
just as good,
happens.
yeah.
Better.
Yeah, it'll be
Better
amazing.
even.
And if you want to ask us questions about Good Omens, shoot them in via the hashtag PratChat15 on social media. If you want to talk about this episode, of course, use the hashtag PratChat14. And to all of those of you who have been already, spreading the word, giving us reviews on iTunes, just tweeting about us, thank you so much. It all helps. If you do listen via the Apple Podcasts app or via iTunes, it does help us if you rate and review the podcast. So please do that if you are enjoying it. And otherwise, just tell people. It's always great to know people are listening. But until next time, when we come back, please do not fall off the edge of the world or strap yourself into a rocket and fire yourself into the stratosphere to prove that it is just a flat disc. Don't do that either. And we will see you next time. You've been listening to Pratchat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchatters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Joel Martin. Pratchat is produced and edited by me, with music by David Ashton of Sample & Hold Studios. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Pratchat Podcast or on the web at pratchatpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag PratChat14.
Pratchat is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrace. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.